No emulators were used in the production of this podcast.
That's awesome, sweetie. Thank you.
This is the Atari Jaguar Game by Game podcast, where we talk about Atari's last home video game console and its library one game at a time. If you're a hater or a fanboy, intellectually curious or morbidly curious, it doesn't matter. I'm glad you're here. Welcome. I am Shinto, and I will be your tour guide as we journey through time and space to learn the story of how the Atari Jaguar came to exist. Well, about 8 years in a couple countries, but the time and space thing sounds much more dramatic. The story of the Atari Jaguar begins in England, land of fish and chips, Time Lords, and a major international airport that'll shut down for 2 days at the slightest snowfall and lose your luggage at the same time. Not that I'm bitter or anything. So yeah, England, Cambridge, 1986, Sinclair Research. 3 engineers, Martin Brennan, Ben Cheese, and John Matheson, leave the company to start their own firm called Flare Technology. That's F-L-A-R-E, as in solar flare. Not F-L-A-I-R, as in, well...
We need to talk about your flare.
Really? I have 15 pieces on.
Flare developed a chipset called Flare 1, which had some impressive audio, video, and animation capabilities. It was built around 3 things, basically. A Z80 CPU, high-quality DSP, digital signal processor for audio, but also other tasks, and a blitter. Now, a blitter is a chip that can rapidly move and modify data in memory, big chunks of data, generally freeing up the CPU for other stuff. It's good for manipulating bitmapped graphics and was apparently known as a raster blaster in some circles. Blitters had been done before. The Commodore Amiga shipped with one, the Atari Mega ST a little later, but the Flare 1's blitter was more flexible and oriented toward gaming. I won't go into great detail here about blitters and how they work, both because that seems a bit outside the scope of this podcast, but also because I don't know. But the Flare 1 prototype could push pixels and sprites like no one's business, and the cool demos garnered favorable press, but they needed to find someone to use it, to take the concept to production and make something cool. They worked with a company called Conix, known mostly for their joysticks, for a project codenamed Slipstream, which would eventually be named the Conix Multisystem. They revised the Flare 1 design, for example swapping out the Z80 CPU for an Intel 8088 and then full 16-bit 8086. Hype started to build, new demos were made, developers signed on, momentum was building, and then Conix ran out of money. The project fizzled and died. Conix put everything they had into the multisystem, but it wasn't enough. While Flare 1 was in the works, the Flare team had thought about what they might do differently, better, in a subsequent design. This included a RISC-based CPU, a custom CPU rather than the Intel 8086, and 3D rendering. They wanted a bigger partner to work with next time, bigger than Conix, one that would be able to provide the necessary funds from the beginning so that they could focus on finishing the Flare 2 design. Will they find such a partner? Will they get their design to market? Will I stop asking questions to which we already know the answer? We'll find out after this.
In the search for the definitive computer simulator game, one name is clearly emerging. Conix Multisystem. Experience the reality. Get behind the wheel of the new Conix Multisystem and you'll really appreciate that powerful 32-bit custom processor. This is real state-of-the-art graphic performance, and even at these speeds, it handles beautifully.
And this is really a display of a lifetime, perfect control over every maneuver, and with over 4,000 different colors to choose from, we're looking at a dazzling graphic display.
Well, have you ever seen anything quite like this? What a powerful machine this is. We're getting the ultimate high performance from its 16-bit microprocessor. And just listen to that. That CD quality sound from the Conix Multisystem. Unbeatable.
Let's cut over to the United States, land of bacon cheeseburgers, comic book movies, and a stubborn resistance to the metric system. A company called Atari needed a new video game console. Some within the company favored a console based on the Atari ST computer, which had some great games, but Atari opted for a different direction. Richard Miller, also a former Sinclair employee, joined Atari in February of 1989 as technical manager in the UK. He came from Perihelion Limited, where he had worked with Atari on the ATW-800 transputer workstation. The ATW-800 was an interesting high-end machine, a parallel computing workstation that ran a Unix-like operating system called Helios, and included a Mega ST for front-end work, paired with an impressive video card called Blossom. So Miller joined Atari near the beginning of '89. He was promoted to the Director of Research and Development a few months later, and a few months after that, was promoted to Vice President of Technology. Not bad, Mr. Miller. Miller and his team was working on a completely new video game console based around the Motorola 68000 CPU, an eSonic sound processor, and a custom object processor. A lead engineer on this team left Atari, so Miller brought on Martin Brennan, remember from Flare, as a consultant to take over the design of the object processor based off the existing specifications. This processor had no name, so Brennan gave it one, Panther, after the Panther Callista Roadster his wife had just bought. The entire console came to be known by this name. In the meantime, even while working on the Panther chip, Brennan was pitching the Flare 2 design to Atari, emphasizing its superior 3D capabilities, which had the potential to totally leapfrog the competition. Atari bought into it, and in June of 1989, a company called Flare 2 Limited was established, of which Atari was an 80% owner. So, Panther and Flare 2 were thus developed simultaneously. Rumor of the Panther's existence first appeared in the November 1990 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. Now, I'm going to be referencing EGM quite a bit in this chronology. It was one of, if not the biggest gaming magazine in the US at that time, and I had a subscription to it. The rumor talks about Panther's advanced 16-bit processor and scaling and multi-field scrolling capabilities that will absolutely positively blow the Super Famicom away. At the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, January 1991, the Panther was privately previewed. Following the show, EGM's February 1991 issue had a bit more information about the Panther. It was said to be a 16-bit system running at an astonishing 16 MHz, astonishing being EGM's word and not presented sarcastically. In 1991, you see, 16 MHz wasn't a bad speed for personal computers, let alone video game consoles. So back to EGM. 16 MHz with built-in scaling capabilities. This all sounds about right. Specifications that I found for the Panther indicate that it had a 16 MHz Motorola 68000 CPU, with the 32-bit Panther object processor running at 32 MHz. Bob Brody, Atari's director of communications, pretty much said that the Panther was a 16-bit project, so despite the 32-bit object processor, the Panther is generally considered to be a 16-bit system. Perhaps the bus was 16 bits wide, I couldn't find any confirmation on that. So Panther was coming along, Jeff Minter of Llamasoft worked up some demos, Psygnosis and Domark reportedly had some games started for it, and then it was cancelled. Why was it cancelled? Well, the video game market primarily. See, the longer Panther took to come to market, the more entrenched Sega and Nintendo's 16-bit products became, and the harder it would have been to compete against them with a 16-bit system, even one as powerful as the Panther. It became clear to Atari that they needed to leapfrog the competition, and the Panther was not the cat for the job. So they canceled Panther to focus efforts on Flare 2, which became known as the Jaguar. Atari CEO Sam Trammell is the one who gave the Jaguar its name, though I did hear somewhere else that Jack Trammell did. Either way, the Jaguar and the Atari Falcon 030 computer became the milestone products for Atari. Jaguar was privately previewed in a hotel suite during the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in June of 1991, but I wasn't able to determine what sort of state the console was in at that time. Word of the Panther's cancellation was in the August 1991 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, in addition to the first mention of the Atari Jaguar appearing in a banner at the top of the cover. I'm guessing EGM or some of its tipsters were at these private previews. A couple months later, in the November 1992 issue of EGM, rumor monger Quarterman expressed doubt that the Jaguar would be 64-bit or be able to render shaded polygons. And in the January 1993 issue, Quarterman talked about Jaguar developer units launching to the US and the UK. In this blurb, he referred to it as a dual 32-bit RISC system, though 4 pages later in the magazine, the Jaguar is reported to be 64-bit RISC and would launch at $99, though maybe as high as $150 without a pack-in. I'll talk about bits and architecture and what RISC means when we get to the guts of the Jaguar a little later. Launch titles were said to include a sports game, a shooter, a flight simulator, and a puzzle game. A keyboard and modem were listed as optional peripherals Atari was planning on releasing. In more official circles, in February of 1993, Bob Brody confirmed that developer units for the Jaguar had been shipping out, and that there have been at least 2 developer conferences, one in the US and one in the UK, which were met with a great deal of enthusiasm. Development could be done on either an IBM-compatible PC or the Atari TT-030 computer, and these development systems cost around $7,500 or $9,000 respectively. In today's money, calculating for inflation, that's $12,000 to just under $15,000. Now we get to the April 1993 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. Now, EGM had a software calendar where they would list upcoming titles and estimated release dates for various platforms. And in this issue, they added a section for the Atari Jaguar. That's right, it's official now. Jaguar's a real thing. This list contained 3 games: Virtua Pong 64, Adventure 199X, and Yar's Revenge 2. That's YAR''S, which any 2600 devotee would know is wrong. Yar's is plural possessive. If that wasn't enough to raise your suspicion, the publishers listed for these games in order were Vey Porware Games, Software RU, and Fooled Again Soft. Shenanigans? Yes, this was their April Fool's joke. The following month, a reader wrote in to commend this, quote, excellent attack on Atari's vaporware promises. I probably shouldn't say, quote, I don't have that issue, I can't find it online, but I pretty much committed that quote to memory, such was my anger. The Jaguar was officially announced on June 3, 1993 at a price of $200, which would include 1 controller and a game. It would launch in New York that fall, with a national rollout within a year. The Jaguar CD was also announced, but I'll talk about the CD attachment separately in a future episode of this podcast. Atari skipped out on the Summer Consumer Electronics Show that year, 93. EGM rumored that it was due to a Jaguar architecture change of one 64-bit processor instead of 2 32-bit processors running in tandem, but that sounds highly inaccurate. Atari did show off a Jaguar development system at the annual shareholder meeting in June of 93. Also in June, Atari announced the Jaguar would be manufactured by IBM at a facility in Charlotte, North Carolina. There was a fair amount of nationalism in the United States at that time regarding products made in the USA, so Sam Trammell made this a priority, saying, quote, as an American company, we are in support of utilizing domestic manufacturing. We are proud that the Jaguar is made in the USA, end quote. It was a $500 million contract to assemble, test, package, and distribute the Jaguar. The actual circuit boards were manufactured and assembled by an IBM subcontractor, and then IBM cased, tested, and packaged the final units before sending them on to Atari. I have a newspaper article here about the IBM contract, which I'll include in the show notes. It basically says what I just said, but it's a yellowed newspaper clipping. That's cool, right? Bishop, crickets. The big unveiling of the Jaguar was on August 18th, 1993. This was a hands-on press event held at the company headquarters in Sunnyvale. I clipped a newspaper article from that event, which I'll include in the show notes. More interesting than the IBM clipping, but just as yellow. Headline, Atari hopes to get back in the fast lane with Jaguar video game. As an aside, it always bothers me when people refer to a video game console or system as simply video game. A video game to me is what a console plays, not the console itself. Anyway, back to the article. It talks about Atari's limited success with the Lynx and with its line of personal computers, and has a quote from Richard Miller. We've never believed in incrementally better designs. You really have to make quantum leaps in performance. Imagine, I assume, a British accent with that quote. The article mentions the $200 price point, the IBM manufacturing contract, the custom 64-bit processors, and the number of transistors per chip, which, if you were curious, was 600,000 and 750,000. Miller goes on to say, these 2 chips took about 3 years to develop. They are a major breakthrough in technology. Then came the quote from Sam Trammell that really grabbed me. He said, we plan to market and advertise the Jaguar very, very heavily. The article mentions $3 million set aside for marketing in 1993 and an additional $45 million in 1994. I was at Toys R Us one day, probably in 1992, and overheard a mom and 2 kids talking about whether they should get a Game Boy or a Game Gear. I strolled by and said that I hate to intrude, but I very much enjoy my Atari Lynx. Nobody in that family had ever heard of the Lynx before. Marketing in these days was not Atari's strong suit, so hearing that they would rectify this with the Jaguar was a very welcome sign to me. The article closes with mention that the Jaguar will launch with 5 games, and Atari hopes to have an additional 40 games in 1994. There was a large picture in this article, which was my first glimpse of the Jaguar itself and its controller. You don't see the entire system, just the bottom half of the main unit with a CD attachment on top. You also see Sam Trammell behind the Jaguar from the perspective of the photographer holding up the controller toward the camera. From this perspective, the controller looks bigger than the CEO's entire head. It's not, of course, but when I showed this article to my friends at school the next day, that's what they focused on, the size of the controller. But I'll get into the controller and the Jaguar's industrial design a little later, but let's get back to the chronology. Atari Explorer Online released a special edition Jaguar issue a few days later. It includes the specifications for the Jaguar, which I won't get into quite yet, but I printed this out on my new 24-pin dot matrix printer, Panasonic KXP1123, the finest dot matrix I ever used, and carried it around with me in my pocket so that I could show my friends how awesome the Jaguar was going to be. Pictures from the August unveiling were featured in the October 1993 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, where I got some good color shots of the core system, a couple with the CD-ROM unit attached, the controller, the box, and several screenshots, including Trevor McFur, 3 pictures of that one, Evolution Dino Dudes, Raiden, Alien vs. Predator, and Alien vs. Predator? My brother and I were huge fans of the movie Aliens. We could quote the entire dialogue by heart. And here is this tiny picture of an alien running down a corridor at you. My interest in the Jaguar turned from, yeah, I'm totally getting this, to must have it now, now, now! Apparently that plus Trevor McFur were playable by the press. EGM called the latter Trevor McFur Saves the Crescent Galaxy. They mentioned this was probably going to be the pack-in. Of McFur, they said it had tons of colors but was very basic with little parallax scrolling. They referred to Alien vs. Predator as a 3D Wolfenstein-type game that was okay, but nothing that hasn't already been done on the Super NES. GamePro magazine's coverage was pretty similar for their October 1993 issue, but generally more positive. They mentioned that the internal DSP is powerful enough to function as a modem, so that you can play games against your friends over the phone or national networks. They mentioned that a Jaguar channel, akin to the Sega channel, may be a possibility, and talk about a virtual reality helmet debuting in 1994. And they even call the Jaguar powerful enough to handle HD TV resolution. Cool. They call Trevor McFur an eye and thumb pleaser, and show some cool 3D animated boss graphics. It has smaller write-ups on games like Cybermorph, Kasume Ninja, Raiden, Evolution Dino Dudes, Tiny Toon Adventures, Club Drive, and Tempest 2000, and briefly touches on Battlezone 2000 with a fully texture-mapped 3D world, Cyberpunk City with a Blade Runner-esque future world, basic sports games, Dracula on CD, and Space Pirates on CD, the latter having comic book-style graphics. I have 2 other newspaper articles from around this time. The first one, I don't have a firm date on this one, but based on the references it includes, it would have been published between August 24th and 28th of 1993. It talks about how Nintendo, Sega, and Atari are attempting to fend off competition from 3DO. I'll include it in the show notes, but it's pretty long and not really worth reading here. I will read the other article, though, which is definitely dated August 28th, 1993, with the headline, Pricey Video Game Systems Leaping to 32 or 64 Bits. It's not long, but it's pretty jaded, so let's read that. Almost everybody has figured out that 16-bit video games like Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis are more powerful, more exciting to look at, and more fun to play than the relatively crude old 8-bit games like Nintendo Entertainment System. But will we now jump, like Mario and Sonic, to buy 32-bit and even 64-bit systems coming this fall that promise even higher levels of performance? In fact, one 32-bit system already exists, the Neo Geo, but with game cartridges selling at $200 a piece, only princes can afford it. Now, Neo Geo is not 32-bit. It has a Motorola 68000 CPU with a Zilog Z80 as a coprocessor. It's no more 32-bit than a Sega Genesis. Going on. Now warming up in the 32-bit bullpen is the much-hyped 3DO system, masterminded by techies who cut their teeth developing the Apple Macintosh computer and the Atari Lynx portable game system. So that's a yes on the Atari Lynx. RJ Michael and Dave Needle did indeed design both the Lynx and the 3DO, but the Macintosh? I'm pretty sure the author meant the Amiga. Those two helped design the Amiga, though Needle did work for Apple at one point. I may be wrong. It's beside the point. Moving on. 3DO should start showing up on dealers' shelves in the next month or two, with hardware selling for $699 and software priced competitively with 16-bit titles. It's $50 to $60. New to the fray is the Amiga CD32 system from Commodore, which will play some of the software already developed for Commodore's unsuccessful CD-TV multimedia system. Commodore claims that it'll be out in October, priced competitively with 16-bit games. Leapfrogging that technology, potentially, is the 64-bit Jaguar computer game system, to be marketed by Atari and manufactured by IBM. Don't hold your breath, Jaguar will be unleashed only in New York and San Francisco this year, and Atari's aim to price this super-fast cat at $200 seems wishful thinking. Well, he's right about that. In fact, you'll need to spend an extra $200 for a total of $400 to get the Jaguar up to top speed, referring to the CD attachment. All three new systems read programs off CD-like optical discs with enormous memory capacity, theoretically allowing for much deeper levels of gameplay than is possible with even the biggest 20 meg cartridge for a 16-bit game. In September of 1993, Atari announced its initial list of 20 third-party game developers for the Jaguar. A couple months later, November 4th, Atari held a media event in the Hemisphere Club on the 48th floor of the Time Life building in New York City. Among the 300-plus reported attendees included retail store buyers, major corporate players, and media. Atari announced the signing of major developers including Virgin, Interplay, Microprose, Ubisoft, Gremlin, Accolade, and Activision. They announced the Jaguar would retail for $249, which is up $50 from the previous estimate.
$50? Now isn't that nice?
And that Atari Games, a separate entity which manufactured arcade games, had licensed a version of the Jaguar architecture for use in upcoming arcade games. This will eventually be known as Kojag, which I'll get into a little later. I say that a lot, but it's true, I will get to it later, it's right here in my outline. Atari also announced special cartridges for the Jaguar CD, which will enable full-screen, high-quality video. Atari showed off 4 finished games at the Fall Comdex event in the middle of November 1993, including Cybermorph, Raiden, Evolution Dino Dudes, and Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy. These became the launch titles. They also previewed Alien vs. Predator and Checkered Flag 2, which would eventually drop the 2 part. And finally, November 23, 1993, the Jaguar was shipping in New York and San Francisco. A friend of mine at school, Chewy, had family in New York and was maybe going to try to snag one for me, such was my excitement, but that fell through. There were around 20,000 units available in these test markets, and they sold quickly. The Jaguar was loose, and I couldn't get one. I was a senior in high school when the Jaguar launched. Like most strapping young men of my age, I would head home after school and watch Computer Chronicles with Stuart Chaffee, which came on at 3:30 p.m. on my local PBS affiliate. One day in January of 1994, Computer Chronicles came on, and when I saw what they were covering, I immediately slammed a hopefully empty-ish videotape into my VCR and hit record. They were at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show and started talking video games, actually mentioning Atari. It didn't come up until the very end of the show, after the 3DO and Nintendo Project Reality, but there it was, a brief overview of the Jaguar. I watched and rewatched that segment over and over, committing it to memory. Thanks to the Internet Archive at archive.org, all Computer Chronicles episodes are freely available, so I'll include the audio for that segment now.
But while Nintendo and Silicon Graphics were talking about a 64-bit game platform, old-timer Atari was shipping its new 64-bit Jaguar game system. It would be sweet irony for Atari, which founded the video game business and then lost it, to come out on top in the next battle with the video game consumer. That's our look at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. For the Computer Chronicles, I'm Stuart Chaffee.
They showed off Alien vs. Predator, an earlier build evidenced by the higher frame rate than what we would see in the finished product, but I'll cover that more in the AVP episode. While it was a small fraction of the coverage that 3DO got, this was awesome. I'd recommend watching the entire episode if you can. There's some good stuff in there, and it's a great glimpse into what computers and other electronics were cutting edge in 1994 if you're into that sort of thing. Bishop, crickets?
Negative. There really is a lot of cool stuff in that episode.
I agree. I saw my first Jaguar advertisement in the February 1994 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. It was a 2-page spread with the headline, "We're chewing up the competition bit by bit." On the left-hand page were screenshots of Trevor McFur, which does look great in screenshot form, Raiden, Checkered Flag, and Cybermorph. On the right-hand page is an additional screenshot, Tiny Toons, but what you really notice is the gigantic drawing of a Jaguar, the cat, pouncing on much smaller drawings of Sonic the Hedgehog and Mario. The picture of Mario is from a game called Yoshi's Cookie. He's wearing a hat and riding Yoshi. I don't know why they chose that one. There's a picture of the Jaguar itself, the console, and its controller, followed by a bit of text. This is the last paragraph. What we're really saying is Jaguar's 64 bits eats the competition alive. Sink your teeth into it and you'll see what we mean. Get bit by Jaguar. That last sentence is in bold and has a trademark symbol next to it. I saw this and thought, this is the best they could come up with? This is what the millions of marketing dollars had generated? Get bit by Jaguar? If I wasn't already set on buying a Jaguar, this ad would have done nothing for me. The next month's issue had a better ad, 4 pages long this time, focusing on the games a little more and simplifying the slogan to simply Get Bit. On March 24th, Atari announced the Jaguar was shipping in Los Angeles, making 3 markets. At the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, held from June 23rd to 25th, Atari showed off the CD attachment to the Jaguar, saying it would ship that fall. They also announced a list of signed developers exceeding 150. It was at this time that the Jaguar rolled out nationwide, and not only that, it was also available in Europe, at least France, Germany, and the UK. Only in the UK it was released with a different name. Yeah, there they called it the Jaguar. Jaguar. Those wacky British always pronouncing words correctly.
Ha ha.
By July of 1994, the advertising slogan had changed to the more well-known Do the Math, which lasted through the end of the Jaguar's lifespan. The July 1994 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly had a mention of the Jaguar in the editor's column, saying that actually locating a Jaguar in a store is a problem, and all he had seen in stores are a few games and spare controllers. I had the same experience, but I'll get into that a little bit later. The Jaguar saw a Japanese launch in November or December of 1994 through the Toys R Us stores in the country, bundled with Alien vs. Predator. In the press, at least for the initial 1993 launch, the Jaguar was awarded Best New Video Game System by Video Games Magazine, Best New Hardware System by Game Informer, and Die Hard Game Fan awarded it either Technical Achievement of the Year or Best New Product of 1993, or both. Electronic Gaming Monthly, now, I'm going off of memory here because I haven't been able to find this intact on the web, had a special buyer's guide section in the December 1993 issue listing all the video game consoles, portable or not, currently available or just on the horizon, and assigned a score to each one. The Jaguar was scored slightly lower than the Amiga CD32, though I'm afraid I don't remember how the 3DO, another of Jaguar's contemporaries, rated in that comparison. I think they're all in the same general ballpark. GamePro magazine, similarly, in their December 1993 issue, had a System Shopper special feature, and I was able to find this online. It reviewed the game consoles on the market and gave their recommendations, which were in the form of a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or in between. The Thumbpad podcast in Australia would call this a Caesar. Getting a thumbs up were the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and the Neo Geo if you could afford it. Getting a thumbs down were the Turbo Duo and the NES. And in between those extremes you find the Sega CD, the 3DO, and the Atari Jaguar. For the Jaguar, they saw the controller as the single biggest problem. Basically, they say, it's a standard Genesis controller with a ton of option buttons, a 12 keypad, and plastic overlays. What's necessarily problematic about it, they don't specify. In talking about the graphics, they refer to Atari's claims that it can move more pixels than the 3DO, and that it won't have any problems outmuscling the 16-bit systems. They'll believe CD quality sound from the cart when they hear it, and its processing muscle looks like it's going to, quote, make slowdown a thing of the past. For software, they said that Atari would be the primary source with 25 games in development, mostly originals and revamped classics with no arcade hits on the horizon. They said that for third-party support, the Jaguar will, quote, need the Capcoms of the world to survive, end quote. And finally, for their recommendation, they say this. Like the 3DO, the Jaguar is a risky investment, just not quite as expensive. If you've got the money, go for it. Atari must learn to attract good third parties, though, and to develop revolutionary games. When you actually found an Atari Jaguar on the shelves, the box was big and black with the Jaguar logo dominating the front under a pair of intimidating, unhappy eyes. In the top left corner, you have the Atari logo with a caption made in the USA. In the top right, had a sticker indicating there is a Cybermorph cartridge included. Along the bottom, you have 6 yellow circles spelling out 64-bit, 64-bit, and interactive multimedia system below that. Later versions of the Jaguar box, without Cybermorph packed in, replace the top right corner with 64-bit power kit, mega power maximum value, and includes Jaguar console, controller, power adapter, and video cable, game cartridge not included. Some variations have an American flag in the top left corner. The back of the box shows the console and controller, screenshots of several games, including Cybermorph, Evolution Dino Dudes, Raiden, Trevor McFur and the Crescent Galaxy, Alien vs. Predator, Tiny Toon Adventures, Club Drive, and Checkered Flag. The text on the back of the box reads as follows. Atari Jaguar 64-bit interactive multimedia system. Interactive electronic entertainment for your home achieved by the power of 64-bit RISC technology. Rich, vibrant graphics, CD-quality digital stereo sound, and an expandable future you'll never outgrow. The Atari Jaguar will take you to the future of digital home entertainment. A source of endless entertainment. An expanding library of new and exciting software experiences takes full advantage of the Atari Jaguar's powerful 64-bit technology. Peripherals allow system expansion to support popular CD formats like CD-based games, audio CDs, and CD+G. There's a list of bullet points, including 64-bit graphics chip with multiple RISC processors, 16.8 million colors with super realistic video motion, CD quality sound in 16-bit digital stereo, 3D graphics with fast realistic animation, high-speed rendering faster than 850 million pixels per second, digital interface ports capable of supporting emerging digital standards, manufactured in the USA by IBM. Whew, I need to take a break from all this marketing speak. Back in a moment.
Additional funding is provided by the Software Publishers Association, providers of educational materials to help manage software. Don't copy that floppy.
Now that we've gone through the timeline, let's talk about the Jaguar itself, what it looks like on the outside, what its guts are like on the inside, and how you control the thing. The Jaguar console is wide and flat and dark gray. It's rounded in the front, squared off in the back. Toward the back on the top is a cartridge slot, and the console itself is rather dominated by a large indentation in the middle where the CD-ROM attachment goes. Like the console, this indentation is rounded in the front, squared off in the back, and has a large convex dome in the middle. The controller ports can be found along the front edge of the system beneath an overhang. There are 2 controller ports, labeled with the numbers 1 and 2 for the left and right ports respectively. The Jaguar supports as many as 8 total controllers through the use of 2 TeamTap peripherals, allowing 4 controllers connected to each port. These ports are high-density DB15 connectors, not unlike a VGA monitor. In fact, I've been able to use some VGA extension cables with the Jaguar controller, some but not all. And between those controller ports is a molded Atari logo, the Fuji symbol. It's kind of funny, I didn't notice the port numbers and Atari logo for some time after I bought the console. There is one single button on top of the console toward the front, bridging the gap between the overhang and the rest of the case. This is a red oval-shaped button used to turn the console on and off, and in front of the button is a power light. On NTSC consoles, the light is red. On PAL-based consoles, the light is green. On the left and right side of the Jaguar console are cosmetic fins, for lack of a better word, which mimic the slotted vents which appear toward the back of the console. The very back contains all the other connectors, which are, from left to right, a power jack, 9 volts at 1.2 amps, a pair of edge cart connectors, which I'll get into in a minute, and an RF audio-video connector. On NTSC consoles, there is a switch next to the RF jack labeled H and L to select between broadcast channels. H is channel 4, L is channel 3. Now back to those edge connectors. While it looks like there could be some sort of removable cover to hide these connectors, there never was, and the ports have always been exposed. The 24-contact connector provides alternate audio and video out, including pins for, in no particular order, stereo audio, red, blue, green, Luma, Chroma, composite, H-Sync, V-Sync, and even some power. Officially, Atari released adapters for composite video and S-video, both including red and white stereo audio connectors. In Europe, Atari released an S-Cart adapter, also known as a Paratel cable, part number J8907. For those of us in the States who have never seen one, S-Cart connectors are a standard audio-video adapter providing clean analog RGB video and stereo audio. You can find homemade adapters on eBay, but some of these are known to have video quality issues, so your mileage may vary. Not mileage, we're talking about Europe. What's the metric equivalent of that idiom? We'll just say equivalent distance. Your equivalent distance may vary. Unofficially, there are a variety of adapters out there, including the ICD Catbox, the Scatologic Scatbox, an RGB cable for connecting the Jaguar to an Atari SC1435 monitor, which I've heard looks pretty awesome, and more. All these provide various ways of using those slot edge connectors on the Jaguar. I mentioned there are 2 edge connectors. The other one, the DSP connector, has 12 contacts and is primarily used for networking. Atari released the JagLink interface to network 2 Jaguars together, and Else Engineering created the JagLink 2 interface, which is compatible with Atari's JagLink, but with the added benefit of daisy chaining more than 2 Jaguars together. The game Doom supports the 2 Jaguar network, while Air Cars and Battlesphere support larger networks, Battlesphere supporting up to 16 consoles in the same game. The DSP connector is also used by the Jaguar voice modem, an unreleased device that allows simultaneous voice and data over the phone line. One game has support for this device, the one-on-one fighter Ultra Vortec, and those with prototype hardware who have tried it out says that it works very, very well. The top of the Jaguar console has the Jaguar logo on the left side toward the front. I haven't described this yet. The logo consists of a rough-edged font with 4 imposing claw marks serving as the downward slant of the letter R. On the overhang, you'll find the printed Atari logo, the horizontal configuration of the Fuji symbol on the left, and along the front edge, the words 64-bit interactive multimedia system. That's all well and good, but what's inside that dark gray case? The Jaguar consists of 5 processors on 3 chips. 2 of those chips, awesomely nicknamed Tom and Jerry, are custom designs. The third chip is the old familiar Motorola 68000. Put simply, Tom focused on graphics, Jerry focused on sound, and the Motorola was there as a kind of general-purpose control processor which bootstraps the machine and gets everything else going. Matheson likened its role to that of a manager who does no real work but tells everybody else what to do. He liked having a chip from the 68K family because it gives developers a familiar starting point. The 68K was heart of the Apple Macintosh and Commodore Amiga and Atari ST, as well as a Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive if you prefer, UK Mike.
Genesis is the name of a band, not a console.
The Sega CD had 2 of them, and the Sega Saturn used one as a sound coprocessor, so yeah, pretty common chip. The 68020 CPU was considered, but deemed too expensive. Tom contains the graphics processing unit, object processor, blitter, remember the blitter, and the memory controller. These were built around RISC architecture, RISC, for Reduced Instruction Set Computing, which is it's a design built around the philosophy that you can get higher performance using simpler instructions at a faster rate than you could complex instructions at a slower rate. Jerry is also RISC-based and contains the digital signal processor as well as timers, UART, which translates between parallel and serial forms, and joystick control. Tying it all together is a system bus, 64 bits wide. There's a fantastic block diagram showing how all the parts fit together, built around the 64-bit bus, and which components access all 64 bits at one time, which components are 32 bits, and so on. It was bundled with an issue of Atari Explorer Online, but I haven't seen this diagram in the wild on the internet like if you do a Google image search, so I'll include this in the show notes. I should also mention that there is a Comlinks signal on the system bus, Comlinks being the communications protocol that the Atari Lynx would use to network multiple units together. In theory, it may be possible to connect Lynxes to Jaguars, but I don't think that's a feat that's ever actually been accomplished.
And now, the question you've all been waiting for.
Is the Atari Jaguar really a 64-bit system? Well, sure. The real question you should be asking is, does it matter? And I would say no, except for the fact that Atari used the 64-bitness as a key marketing point, and therefore, yes, it does matter, so it is something we should discuss. Bishop, I might need your help with this one.
Understood.
So we will discuss it using an automotive analogy. Everybody loves automotive analogies.
I don't think that's true.
Well, regardless, that's what I'm going with. Imagine an interstate, or motorway, if you prefer, that is a massive 64 lanes wide. You can fit 64 cars side by side on this road at any given time. And over at the Tom chip, that's Disneyland. There are 64 off-ramps into Disneyland. That's how popular it is. That's where the magic happens. And it's not just Disneyland, it's Disney California Adventure and Downtown Disney all in the same place. You park in one spot and you can walk to all 3. Even 64 people at a time can move from one part to the other. That's how wide the entrances are. Over on the other side, you have Jerry, and that's Knott's Berry Farm, the theme park, Knott's Berry Farm. It's cool and everything, but not nearly as popular as Disneyland, so you only have 32 off-ramps from that 64-lane highway. You could have built 64 ramps, I suppose, but what's the point if attendance is only half as much as Disneyland? Off-ramps are expensive, man, so you don't want to build them unless you absolutely have to. Down at the bottom, in the 68,000 district, that's In-N-Out Burger.
Wait, what?
Bear with me here, I'm actually going somewhere with this. So, you're quite familiar with In-N-Out Burger. You would go there all the time in your hometown of, let's say, Tucson. You know what you like there. You know that you prefer the vanilla shake to the chocolate shake and exactly how much salt to add to your fries. So here's an In-N-Out in Anaheim. The Jaguar's Anaheim, apparently. So you know exactly what to expect when you walk through the door. In-N-Out is popular, but they can only flip so many burgers, so there are only 16 off-ramps to In-N-Out Burger. Here's the thing. In-N-Out Burger is great and comfortable and everything, but it's not a theme park. It can only do so much. And also, Disneyland is expensive, especially if you have kids.
This analogy is getting better all the time.
I know, right? So, not only is Disneyland expensive, you can buy a 3-day pass and still not see everything. But you don't have 3 days, or 4 days, or 6 days, or however long it takes to master Disneyland. All you have is 45 minutes, and, well, In-N-Out will have to do. That, my friends, is the Atari Jaguar. It's 64-bit where it needs to be, isn't where it doesn't, but a lot of games just hung around the Motorola 68000 and that's it, both because it's familiar and also because really grasping the 64-bit parts is tricky and time-consuming. That's in part because, unlike Disneyland, the maps you were provided when you walked through the ticket counter in Jaguar Development Land were vague and potentially inaccurate, with large sections of the map labeled, "Figure out your own implementation," so you could, but that takes a lot of extra time and exploration, and you're on a deadline to ship in time for Christmas. But you can bet that your advertising brochure will tout your 64 lanes of traffic because most cities have only 16 lanes, and some of the newer ones under construction are only going to have 32, so yeah, you're gonna flaunt your ability to process traffic, absolutely. There are other problems with the city, though, besides the maps that you're handed as you fork over a chunk of money to get in. What would happen if everybody from Disneyland, 64 vehicles at a time, drove over to In-N-Out Burger for lunch? That would be a disaster. In-N-Out is not equipped to handle everyone from Disneyland at one time. You might be wondering why there's even an In-N-Out Burger connected to this massive highway in the first place if it can only handle a quarter of Disneyland's traffic, or half of Knott's Berry Farm's traffic. Well, as I said, it's not a theme park. Maybe it would have been better to replace In-N-Out Burger with Universal Studios Hollywood, a more entertaining destination that can handle a lot more people inside at one time. But think of the cost. Maybe some type of high-speed interchange instead with fancy automatic lunch dispensers? I don't know. The point is that In-N-Out was built there largely because it's quite popular in the American Southwest and therefore many, many people are familiar with it. Another problem with the Jaguar is that you couldn't really execute code out of main memory. So, say downtown Disney is the Jaguar's DRAM, and you want to walk from there to Disneyland because it's right there, but you didn't get a ticket, so you can't just walk through
I think it's probably about time to drop this analogy.
Okay, yeah, you're probably right, Bishop. The point is that just because the Jaguar is a 64-bit system, which it is, doesn't mean that all the games are going to be awesome, which they're not. This was a period of time in home video game console history when arguing about the number of bits a particular system could handle was more important than any other metric. The thing is, there's no reliable set of criteria to determine this number. There still isn't. Trip Hawkins of 3DO at this time famously said that the Jaguar is just two 32-bit processors running in parallel. I say famously because I can't find a reliable first-party source of this quote. It's often repeated with or without Hawkins' attribution, so it's generally accepted as true that the Jaguar is just two parallel 32-bit CPUs. Here's an example. It's kind of amusing in a sad way. The Wikipedia article for the Nintendo 64 says that the Jaguar only used a 64-bit architecture in conjunction with two 32-bit RISC processors and the 68K. If you visit the source of this information, it does say that, but it also says that two processors were actually 64-bit. So some Wikipedia editor was being highly selective. Don't use Wikipedia as your primary source. Another thing I found while researching this, another example of bit confusion that I found amusing, was in the December 1993 issue of GamePro magazine, in which they said that the Atari 2600 and 5200 are 4-bit systems. Does all this matter? Not really. It's a technical contrivance, an oversimplified number for marketing types and fanboys. In reality, there's a lot more to how powerful a video game console or computer is than just one number. And I'd even venture so far as to say that the Atari Jaguar was the death knell for the bit wars. Rob Sedibble, the famous Atari engineer who worked on everything from the 2600 through the Jaguar, spoke about it briefly in an interview with Retro Gaming Roundup. He was principal engineering programmer for the Jaguar and talked about the difficulty troubleshooting the custom processors. There was no way to get inside the hardware to debug it. When he found a bug that he could reliably reproduce, he'd have to enter into a back and forth with one of the hardware engineers. All this was time-consuming, and when the Jaguar shipped, there were bugs in the silicon. But listen to that episode 75 of Retro Gaming Roundup for the full story. I had mentioned earlier that the Jaguar architecture was licensed for use in arcade games in a platform known as Kojag. Kojag had a couple enhancements over the regular Jaguar. First, the Motorola 68000 CPU was replaced, either by a 68020 or a Silicon Graphics R3000. There's also more memory. The arcade game Area 51 doubled the Jaguar's RAM to 4 megabytes, and the game Maximum Force tripled it to 6 megabytes. Both included a hard drive as well. These two light gun shooters were the only arcade games to use the Kojak architecture. The Jaguar's controller predates the Jaguar, at least as far as the interface goes. The Atari STE computers, released in 1990, note that this does not include the Mega STE, featured a pair of enhanced joystick ports, or EJPs, in addition to the traditional 9-pin joystick or mouse ports. The Falcon 030, released in 1992, also had these controller ports. The Falcon PowerPad controller looks almost like a photo negative of the Jaguar controller, light gray with blue fire buttons. What came first, the Jaguar controller design or the Falcon PowerPad? I don't know. I couldn't find anything definitive on that, or any other controllers which would use the enhanced joystick port. There was a rumor in the April 1991 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly that the Panther was going to include a number pad on the controller, so perhaps the Jaguar controller dates back to the Panther days at least. Here's how the controller is laid out. The Jaguar's stock controller has a digital directional pad, 3 fire buttons at an angle going from bottom left to top right, labeled C, B, and A. Between the D-pad and the fire buttons were 2 smaller rubber buttons, pause and option. Below all this was a 12-key number pad, similar to what you would find on a telephone, or Intellivision, ColecoVision, or Atari 5200. The numbers 1 through 9, going from top left to bottom right, 0 in the bottom center, flanked by an asterisk and pound key. The number pad has the same type of rubber buttons used by the pause and option buttons. Holding down the asterisk and pound keys served as a system reset sequence so that you could completely restart the game without having to get up and power cycle the console. There are 2 slots on each side of the number pad, which are used to hold the game-specific overlays, assigning clear functions to those 12 buttons. The controller is wide and thick, flat on the bottom, rounded on the sides and top, with the cable extruding from the top above a decorative series of grooves. It is very comfortable to hold and use, in my opinion, fitting the full hand rather than just your fingertips. The arc of the fire buttons follows the thumb well, and the D-pad is wide and responsive, a full circle with the 4 cardinal directions raised above the rest. The Dreamcast controller is similarly large, though with thinner hand grips. I like the Dreamcast controller too, although I do understand that it's also polarizing. Later, in October of 1995, Atari released a revised version of this controller called the Pro Controller. It contains 3 more fire buttons, or face buttons if you prefer, labeled X, Y, and Z, in a similar reverse alphabetical order from left to right, as well as 2 shoulder buttons, L and R. These are mapped to buttons on the number pad, 7, 8, and 9 for Z, Y, and X respectively, while the L and R buttons are mapped to 4 and 6. It was slightly slimmer and lacked the decorative grooves at the top, but added washboard-style ridges on either side of the keypad. It's generally considered more comfortable but harder to find. At the time of the Jaguar's release, one-on-one fighting games were all the rage, and 3 face buttons seemed a bit limiting. In 1993, Sega released a 6-button version of its controller for the Genesis/Mega Drive. Street Fighter II on the Sega Genesis using the 3-button controller required use of the start button to switch between punches and kicks, for example, so to be competitive with these popular fighting games, a 6-button controller was a must. The 3DO controller, released around the same time, also had 3 face buttons, but supplemented these with a pair of shoulder buttons. So in terms of contemporary systems, the Jaguar's action buttons numbered fewer than other consoles. What was Atari thinking? I can only speculate. Perhaps they didn't know that one-on-one fighting games were going to be such a big thing. Perhaps they didn't care. Maybe they were focusing more on computer games than arcade games, where a computer keyboard would be very handy for switching weapons or flipping on the map screen or whatever. Whatever the case, the keypad was no help in fighting games, which I'll get into with my review of Primal Rage coming up in future episodes. Other than that, other than cross-platform fighting games, I really like the Jaguar controller, both versions, and still do. I wish I bought more than one Pro controller while they were still reasonably priced. Let's talk about the Jaguar's cartridges. Cartridges could contain up to 6 megabytes or 48 megabits of data, and could contain an EEPROM, electronically erasable programmable read-only memory, to store settings, high scores, and saved games. It's said that you could write to this chip 100,000 times before it might start to fail, which should take on the order of decades depending on how heavily you save data to that cartridge. Physically, the carts are rectangular with a curved handle-like thing on top. The front of the cart is dominated by the game label, and below that are a series of narrow ridges. There is no top label, the round handle kind of ruins that. so it can be hard to find games when they're arranged vertically. What I do, I stack them in a drawer loosely so that I can flip through them like records in a record store, assuming there are still record stores that sell records and my analogy is not completely lost on you. The back of the cartridge has the Atari logo heavily embossed. Looks cool, at least for first-party games. Third-party games typically lack the Atari logo on the back. You can actually find 2 different colors of Atari carts. Most come in gray to match the console, but a few are also released in black. These are early release games including Cybermorph, Dino Dudes, Raiden, and Trevor McFur, and one non-launch title, Club Drive. My Raiden and Cybermorph carts are black, the rest are dark gray, except for Battlesphere Gold, but that's way down the road in this podcast. The Atari 5200's cartridges had slots in the back to store the overlays. Seldom used in my experience finding 5200 games in the wild, but a neat feature. The Jaguar's cartridges don't do this. You're left to find another way to store your overlays. Me, I would stack them all together with a rubber band. That was my first strategy. Eventually, I came across a small Ziploc-style bag that fit the overlays pretty well. I haven't lost any overlays in 20 plus years, so it is possible to hang on to those. There were usually printouts of the overlays in the game manuals, but if you lost both the manuals and the overlay, or found the cart loose and lonely, Atari Age helpfully has copies of all the overlays available for download. So let's say you have an Atari Jaguar, you have a Jaguar game and a power adapter, and then you plug that game into the Jaguar and turn it on. What happens next? Well, many Jaguars emit a slight hissing sound if you listen closely. It's been said that the earlier models did this and the later ones did not. I've owned 3 and they all made that sound. Some say it's the RF generator, some say it's a coil on the motherboard. Either way, the sound is harmless and it's not anything to worry about. Hiss or no hiss, you have the power light on, red or green, depending on the region, and if the Jaguar is correctly connected to a television that itself is powered on, you should hear a roar as the Jaguar logo zooms into view, scaling in from the black background. There will be a pause, followed by the letters of the name Atari rolling into view as a jingle plays in the background. It ends with an orchestra hit as the registered trademark symbol appears, and then the Jaguar logo slides up to the top, making room for a rotating cube to zoom in to the center. On each face of the cube is a picture of a Jaguar, the actual big cat. The pause between the Jaguar logo and the tumbling Atari letters, that's not just for dramatic effect, but that's when the cartridge authentication is going on. Atari had a 518-bit key used to authenticate cartridges and prevent, Imagic and Mythicon and American Video Game and Froggo from making unauthorized carts, assuming any of those were still in business, which they weren't. Each cart contained a special 8K header that is decoded by the Jaguar boot sequence and compared against an MD5 digest of the cartridge's contents to determine whether or not the cartridge should be allowed to start. Creating this MD5 hash takes longer depending on the size of the cartridge, so 32 megabit games like Doom take longer than 16 megabit games like Club Drive. Very early on in this boot sequence, the screen may turn red, which is known as the red screen of death. Usually this is caused by poor contact between the cart and the Jaguar. If you see this happen with every game you try, the culprit could be bent pins on the Jaguar's cartridge connector, though that is pretty rare. If it's just one cartridge and you've cleaned the connectors and still red screens on you, then the cartridge itself could be defective. That also is pretty rare, but I did have a copy of Iron Soldier that would red screen on me no matter what I tried, so it is possible. So that's all behind the scenes. Let's talk more about what you see on the screen, or rather, what you hear. There is a very interesting interview with Alex Rudis, known more commonly as LX, the famous sound engineer and musician. Well, famous among Atari enthusiasts. He wrote some of the best music to be heard on the Atari Lynx, in my opinion. The Atari Times interviewed him in 2002, and he had this to say about the Jaguar's boot sequence. An Atari employee named Rob Loads went to the zoo with a DAT recorder to capture some Jaguar roaring sounds, but was told there that the Jaguars don't actually roar, but rather hiss. So Rob went back to the zoo later and captured a lion's roar instead. After downsampling the recording to fit on the Jaguar hardware, it sounded more like a toilet flush than a roar, according to LX. I did some research of my own, and found that Jaguars can in fact roar, along with lions, tigers, and leopards.
Oh my.
In fact, all big cats of the genus Panthera are capable of roaring, except maybe for the snow leopard. They have a larynx supported by elastic ligaments necessary to produce a roar. Interesting. So a Jaguar's roar sounds a little something like this. Compare that with the Jaguar's boot-up roar. I don't know, that sounds reasonably similar to my untrained ear, but I'm not a cat person. Anyway, continuing with the interview, Alex worked off a copy of one of Atari's old commercials and put together the little jingle. What you hear is not his first attempt, oh no. He put together an awesome arrangement that stunned his colleagues. Unfortunately, it also stunned the system, that is, crashed it. It took about 20 iterations before he had something that would actually work, and this is the end result. As long as we're on the topic of LX and sound in the Jaguar, Leonard Trammell was of the opinion that music composers really needed to know how the machine worked, since non-technical artists might generate problematic compositions. LX agreed with this, and the lack of intersection between computer programmers and good music composers was small and greatly limited the number of people who could effectively do sound the way Atari wanted to do sound. Atari wanted to use the Jaguar's synthesis capabilities rather than employ sampled sounds, but the audio tools weren't all that great. Going back to the boot sequence for a moment, there's an Easter egg that allows you to control the spinning cube. If you hit both pause and option while the Jaguar logo is displayed, you can press up or down to control the cube's size, make it spin faster or slower by pressing left or right, and reverse the direction of the spin with the 0 button. To get out of this, press pound and asterisk to reboot.
From the Atari 7800 Game by Game podcast and the No Sir Gamer on YouTube, I am the No Sir Gamer, and you're listening to the Atari Jaguar Game by Game podcast.
With your hosts Shinto and Bishop.
So let's see what Shinto has to say today. Go get him, Shinto!
So how did I actually acquire a Jaguar? I used to live in the Denver, Colorado area. Driving down Colorado Boulevard one night, I saw a large sign with the Atari logo. Ooh, what is this place? Does Atari have Denver offices? No, they didn't, but this is even better. It was a store called Horizon Computers. It was an Atari retailer. All they sold were Atari items, 8-bit software and peripherals, ST computers, calculators. It was awesome. It was like visiting the store in the movie Cloak and Dagger. The owner even looked a little bit like the actor counterpart in the movie. I would come back to the store as often as I could, even just to buy a floppy disk or two, which is usually all I could afford. Before the Jaguar's launch, Horizon Computers moved to a cheaper office elsewhere in town. Cheaper, I think it was slightly larger though, it was more open feeling, more windows. I put down $100 to pre-order my Jaguar, which I was sure would make me one of the first Jaguar owners in the state, and drooled over the Falcon 030 that I wanted to buy for music composition. He said I would need a gigabyte hard drive for that. Really, a whole gigabyte? It would be a bit of a wait. I don't remember the exact month I placed my pre-order, but a closer store, a Walden Software, began stocking Jaguar items. No systems, just a few of the launch titles and a couple spare controllers, that was it. I bought a controller, even without a system or games, I bought a controller. Brought it to school with me to show it off. What games can you play? Nothing yet, I don't have the console. When I could afford it, I bought my first game, Raiden, still before the console came in. The two other games they had there at Walden Software were Evolution Dino Dudes and Trevor McFur. They also had magazines. I had a subscription to EGM at the time, which I mentioned, but I would flip through GamePro and bought Die Hard Game Fan when I saw Cybermorph on the cover, but I'll get into that in the next episode. So I had an extra Jaguar controller, I had a game that both my brother and I could play simultaneously, just sorta needed the Jaguar itself. A few weeks later, I got the call. There was a Jaguar there at Horizon Computers with my name on it. I drove over as soon as I could and paid the remaining $150 plus tax. They had a console set up playing Alien vs. Predator, the Marine mission, so I watched someone play that for a little while. My first impression, honestly, was not that great. The frame rate was slower than what I saw on the winter CES episode of Computer Chronicles. I was still getting it, no doubt about that, just not quite as excited as I once was. I didn't have the money at the time for anything else, so I carried my brand new Jaguar out to my crummy old car and drove home. Horizon Computers later moved to another office, smaller in a sketchier part of town, and then disappeared entirely in October of 1996. I've got contact information for the owner of that store. May try to interview him later. I'm still trying to figure out how to incorporate researching, recording, and editing this podcast into my life while still maintaining my role as husband, father, and valued employee. It's a work in progress, and that's fine. That's kind of to be expected. So last Saturday morning, dogs got me up early, and I realized at that point that I had managed enough sleep to function a couple hours without coffee, so I sat down to do principal recording for this episode. I don't know how other one-man show podcasters do it, but I record all my prepared material, then go back later and edit it into something that flows well and is concise, removing all the flubbed words and long gaps and so forth. I managed to get almost everything recorded before the kids woke up, at which point it was time to put away the microphone and be a father. I read that the first thing you should do when you wake up in the morning is to drink a large glass of water because you went all night without any fluids and may be a bit dehydrated come morning. I didn't do that. Instead, I let the dogs out, sat down, and recorded over an hour and a half of material. Material which, believe it or not, involved a whole lot of talking. Even stopping to drink some water while recording didn't make up for the lack of water before I sat down, so my voice wasn't at its best. Doesn't seem to be now either. I bring these things up because I went through and edited this episode, and as I did so, I realized I completely forgot about the part where I talk about how some Jaguar controller buttons are black, whereas others are gray. The gray ones are probably manufactured earlier and the black ones later, and that the controllers could also have different thicknesses in their cables. There's a thread on Atari Age about this, which I'll include in the show notes. I also neglected to mention that on most Jaguar games, you can adjust one or more volumes by pressing pause and then A, B, or C. Additionally, some games will let you wipe out the EEPROM by holding down star, option, and pound keys. I learned some things while researching future episodes, which could have very well fit into this chronology, but were discovered after principal recording. First, while researching Cybermorph, I learned that Fred Gill of ATD encountered a major bug that was crashing Cybermorph while the game was still in development. Gill ended up driving from Birmingham to Cambridge every day for 2 weeks to work with Flare 2 and track down this bug. That's over an hour and a half each way? With Gill's help, the Flare 2 team was able to identify the hardware bug and get a fix in before the Jaguar went into production. Without that extra dedication on Gill's part, the Jaguar story could have been very different. It could have been a whole lot shorter. This would have fit in well with the Rob Zadibble part. Perhaps if Zadibble was able to commute to Cambridge, that would have helped. When researching Trevor McFur and the Crescent Galaxy, I stumbled across more detail on the media event Atari held just prior to launch. This is in the Time Life building. It was said that no expense was spared in this event. You had models in cat costumes slinking around. You had a jungle theme throughout with tropical plants, bamboo, fog machines, animal sound effects. There were blue neon accents, a number of large monitors positioned throughout the room showing gameplay footage and commercials. And this included 6 monitors linked together behind the stage. There were between 10 and 16 playable kiosks scattered around, a huge buffet, even dancers in cages, which I guess no press event should be without. This information comes from a live chat on Genie with Bob Brody and others that evening, recorded in Atari Explorer Online, Volume 2, Issue 19. That chat also includes mention of the Atari 1224 and 1435 color monitors being used in demo kiosks. I've only used a few demo kiosks, and I don't recall if they were Atari monitors inside those or not, but that's pretty cool. There were also a couple instances I found in my recording where I used poor subject-verb agreement, which is entirely beneath my standards. You might be asking, why then didn't I go in and fix all this, use my audio editor and fix the minor grammar infractions and phrasing and add the extra info? That brings up the bigger problem. See, I am a big fat perfectionist, and I...
Shinto?
Yes, Bishop?
Have you looked at yourself in a mirror recently?
A mirror?
You are not fat at all. In fact, you are quite thin. In fact, you should probably go make yourself a sandwich right now.
Okay, Bishop, I'm beginning to think the webcam was a bad idea. You're starting to creep me out. I'm just gonna reach back there and unplug the camera now.
Wait.
What?
There is a spider on my camera's USB connector.
Spider?
I'm pretty sure it's venomous.
You can't know that. How could you know that? You don't have sensors in the rear of your case. There's no way for you to know that there's a spider living back there.
I just checked Wikipedia. Definitely venomous.
Okay, I'm pretty sure you're just making that up. I'm just gonna...
You're right. I'm making it up. Go ahead and reach back there, behind my case where it's dark, and fumble around for the right USB connector for the camera. Go ahead. I'll wait.
Maybe later. Can I get back to the podcast recording now?
Of course. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so I was saying what a big fat,
tall,
thin perfectionist I am. Any minor difference in my voice or microphone position or other audio qualities would be entirely unacceptable. When I record segments for other podcasts and notice poor phrasing or cadence or other glitches, I would simply re-record the entire thing, 4 or 5 minutes, no big deal. The urge was very, very strong to re-record the entirety of the Jaguar's launch story, but there is no way I'd be able to find another couple hours, quiet hours to myself to record again, so I left it. I did the best editing job I could and left the flaws. I probably could have had Bishop help with the editing, much like how Inversataski pulls it off with Rob's computer voice, but Bishop is pretty busy already, watching me with that camera and offering unsolicited health advice. How about something else to do? Bishop, do you have any feedback to include in this episode?
We do. 6 emails and 4 audio submissions.
Excellent. Are Atari Age private messages included with the emails?
Do you get an email when you receive an Atari Age private message?
Yes.
Then what do you think?
I think I need to adjust your snark level a bit. Go ahead and queue up those messages, please, Bishop.
Ready.
First email is from Brian. Brian says, "Wow, Shinto, you decided to jump into the deep end of a very small pool. I've enjoyed listening to the 2600 Game by Game, but this podcast is of special interest to me. The Jag was the first system I bought on my own, not a hand-me-down or Christmas gift, and outside of T2K and AVP, it was such a comprehensive disaster that it created a kind of Stockholm Syndrome between myself and Atari. I purchased the Jag CD and have a reasonable collection of games, including Defender 2000, Primal Rage, and Iron Soldier 2. You're one up on me there, I don't have IS2. It was a lonely place to game, but I eventually talked a friend into purchasing a Jag on the cheap so that we could play Network Doom. Oh yeah, I have a Jag Link too. Between that and Ultra Vortec, we found the fun that many Jag games tried so hard to bury under poor graphics, spotty control, and monotony. My favorite game, no surprise, has always been Tempest 2000. Sweet mother, what a game. In retrospect, it deserves so much more than to be lost to obscurity, re-released on various platforms, than a sequel put out on a new one. New one? Yep, new one. Why both games haven't been released on virtual consoles everywhere is sad and infuriating. Maybe a podcast idea. The VLM was fantastic as well. Unfortunately, the cartridge slot on my original Jag is beginning to go, but thankfully I have spares. I'm hoping that listening to your podcast will give me good reason to spend time with some games that I haven't played in a long time, as well as see them with fresh eyes. Thanks, and I wish you all the best. By the way, I appreciate your desire to keep the podcast family-friendly. Don't let the games beat you." Thank you, Brian. Yeah, like you, the Jaguar is the first new system that I bought on my own using money from my own job. I had a friend buy a Jaguar. It wasn't due to my own prompting, it was because he liked playing my Jaguar so much. Pinball Fantasies was his favorite, but he also loved Cannon Fodder, a game that I didn't own during the Jaguar's lifespan. My brother bought his own Jaguar when he went off to college, including a copy of Doom. I think we might have tried linking our Jaguars together for Doom once or twice, but I don't remember specifically. I don't think it was very long that we did that. I've never played Tempest 3000 on the new one. I have a new one, a Samsung DVD N501 with a Logitech gamepad, but it only seems to be able to read professionally pressed discs, no CDRs. I had burned a bunch of CDRs of new on homebrew titles, but it can't seem to read those anymore, so the only game that I have for the new one is the pack-in, Ballistic. I'm not keen on buying additional new on games because who knows if it could read them, and if so, how long they would last. I'm sure you're aware of the unofficial spiritual successor to Tempest 2000, TXK, for the PlayStation Vita. I do own that game, but I don't have a Vita to play it on. I bought the game during the whole legal hubbub between Minter and the current holder of Atari intellectual property. Someday I'll get a Vita or a PlayStation TV and actually play TXK, which I've heard is simply awesome. You're right that there is fun to be found in Jaguar games, and that's a big reason why I'm doing this podcast. Let's go find the fun. Thank you for the email, Brian, and I hope you'll continue to send in submissions as we go along. Next up is RJ from Atari Age. RJ says, "Well, whatever the first Christmas the Jaguar was released, 93, 94, is when my tale occurs. I had previously moved out of my parents' home and was sharing a house with 2 friends. My rent was insanely low, so I usually had spare change, and as an Atari fanboy, I was an early adopter of the Jaguar. I visited the local electronics boutique, my gaming store of choice back then. I got a Jaguar, an additional controller, and the infamous Trevor McFur and the Crescent Galaxy. I took out my checkbook, however, the store manager said that due to numerous bad customer checks that holiday season, EB would not take checks over $300, which my total exceeded. I had no credit card or cash with me, so this inconvenienced me greatly. My credit union wasn't nearby, so I grudgingly left the mall to make a withdrawal there. Upon my return, the manager and sales clerk were very apologetic, and the manager included the game free for my trouble. Wow. As stated above, I was a lifelong Atari fanboy, still kinda am, and I never regretted my Jaguar purchase. My buddy's Genesis was the main game system in our house at the time, but in my opinion, the new cat in town unseated it. We took some shots at each other about which system was best, but I recall him being impressed by Cybermorph. I actually played Trevor McFur and beat it quite handily due to a programmer oversight, but I won't go into that here. Hopefully you'll go into that in the Trevor McFur episode 3. My next game was Tempest 2000. Alien vs. Predator and Dino Dudes were bought in there somewhere too. I discovered Babbage's in the new Mall of America just a short drive away, and my Jaguar collection grew. Off and on, I had about 40 games, and likely 99% were bought at Babbage's and that electronic boutique. Eventually, I moved out of the bachelor house. In the 90s, Escade moved on. Newer systems came along, Saturn, PlayStation, N64, etc., but I never gave up on my Jaguar. Sure, I had played other systems, but always kept my Jag, until 3 months ago. Things happen in life, unforeseen things. Something came along called Minecraft, which people went absolutely crazy for, including my kids. They only got into it recently and were hogging our iPads to play it. So I assessed the situation, bit my lip, and sold all my Jaguar stuff. I let it go along with my smallish SNES collection, sorry Soulblazer, for practically a song to a local retro gamer. I used the money for a PS3, spare controller, and several kid-centric co-op games for my boys. I don't play it much, as I'm retro at heart. They're probably spending way too much time on it, but when I see some of my kids' incredible ideas and the things they've built, I can't help but give them some leeway and smile. I know I did the right thing, and I don't regret my sale. After all, when I was a kid, was my time spent any differently? Wow, RJ, your story sounds eerily familiar. So, yeah, like you, most of my games were purchased in stores like Babbage's and Electronics Boutique. Mine are mostly Walden Software, which is closer than the other two, but they're all about the same. My friend Chewy would ask me to bring my Jaguar over to his apartment when we had little get-togethers. It didn't really unseat any existing console, but it was new and interesting, and we had fun with it. Not Trevor McFur, though. Different games. So I just mentioned my brother's Jaguar. He had a base unit with around a half dozen games, some of the best titles like AVP, Tempest, Iron Soldier, Ultra Vortec, Rayman. He gave all of his Jaguar stuff to me because his wife, now ex-wife, didn't like having video games in the house. And I took all that stuff down to the local used video game store to trade it in because they're all duplicates for me. I already had Jaguar and all the games. So I traded that in so that I could get a used PlayStation 3 for the family for Christmas, mostly for Minecraft. It would have been cheaper to go with a PC edition, but on a console like the PlayStation 3, you can do split-screen multiplayer, 4 people at a time at most, and that's really what I was after. My whole family could participate in it if we wanted it, so that's what I went for. I'm a big fan of Minecraft, actually. I see how excited my kids get about it, how they talk about what structures they're going to build. It's great motivation for them to get their responsibilities done so that they can play. And they play very well together. That can't be said about some other things. So even though you had to part with your Jaguar, RJ, I think you made the right call. Perhaps our kids will look back on Minecraft the way we look back on Atari. I think it's time well spent. The imagination and creativity that I see from my kids in Minecraft, it overrides my parental impulse to turn the game off after an hour or so. There is a lot of retro gaming goodness available on the PlayStation 3, like PS1 Namco collections, Sega Genesis collection, a lot of neo-retro indie games if you like those. My kids seem to focus on Minecraft exclusively these days, but I'm impressed with the number of kid-friendly co-op games like Little Big Planet, Ibn Ob, Child of Light, Flow is okay. A bunch more that I can't think of right now. So who knows, maybe someday they'll tire of Minecraft long enough to actually play those other games that I bought for them. And your kids as well. No sign of that after 8 months for me, though. But thanks, RJ. Great submission. It is great to hear from you. Next email is from McRory on Atari Age. McRory says, so I bought the Jaguar at quote-unquote launch. I say that in quotation marks because Don Thomas, VP of Marketing, was making offers on some listserv or area, maybe Usenet, that if you sent him a money order for $225, he would have Atari send you a brand spanking new Jaguar on launch day. Except that did not happen. The higher-ups at Atari took all of the Jaguars and sent them to Best Buy and other places to be sold at retail. That meant a ton of people that paid ahead of time with Dawn were SOL for about 2 weeks. It made me so mad. The only bonus was that the first unit shipped with old-style RF connectors that wouldn't work, so by the time I got mine, they had the Radio Shack automatic selectors, which still stunk because they let in an amazing amount of interference. Anywho, that's my story. Eventually bought a Jaguar store kiosk from Atari at $100, maybe $150, when they went out of business. Thanks for the email, McRory. I was on Usenet a lot back then, rec.games.video.atari, and I don't recall seeing such a message from Don Thomas, but I could have missed it, entirely possible. I do remember Don Thomas after the fall of Atari. He ran a website called icwen.com, letter I, letter C, W-A-G-N, and I liked what he put up there, but that's terrible that he solicited money from eager Jaguar fans and then failed to deliver. That'll certainly sour your Jaguar experience. Did your kiosk include an Atari-branded monitor with the RGB cable, or was it just like a regular TV? Either way, I'm sure the picture quality is way better than RF. If you can get away from RF, do it. The Atari Jaguar is not known for solid RF output quality. Next up is Ross, otherwise known as Lost Dragon on Atari Age. He says, I'm not sure my humble Jaguar story will make for good reading, but if you're after something from the UK perspective, I can offer mine. I'm definitely after the UK perspective. I've been a gamer ever since I convinced my folks to buy me a Sinclair ZX81 to help with my schoolwork, smiley face. And of course used it for nothing but playing likes of Mazog's 3D Monster Maze, etc., etc. From there I went to the Atari 2600, a console it seemed everyone in the UK had in their household. I had just started secondary school at the time, and there were many people in my year and above that owned one. No one I knew had any consoles like the Intellivision. One person had a ColecoVision, but Atari simply had the market sewn up. Then I moved on to the Atari 800XL, thanks to Atari UK dumping stocks to UK electrical chains. And what a contrast. Whilst everyone else had CBM 64s and Sinclair ZX Spectrums or even Amstrad CPCs, only a mere handful of us had 800XLs, and Atari's home micro presence at this time seemed pitiful. You had as much chance of meeting a CBM C16 or BBC Electron owner as another 800XL owner. Chronic shortage of software meant I had to sell the 800XL and move to the CBM C64, which I loved, but when it came time to jump to 16-bit gaming, the ST was the ideal choice. £100 cheaper than the Amiga and bundled good range software. I and many others paid the same for a 520 STM and 2 brand new games, as we would have had to pay for an Amiga, and initially everything was great. Sadly, it became clear that Atari was losing the 16-bit war here in the UK. The Amiga had seen its price drop. The Batman pack had seen the hardware flying off the shelves. Games started appearing on Amiga first. And a lot of the UK press started reviewing Amiga versions first, as publishers knew Amiga versions would score higher marks than ST versions. So ST versions reduced to follow-up updates, mini-reviews in later issues, or a few lines explaining the weaker visuals, ropey scrolling, and worse sound. The STE was announced, promised a lot, but failed to meet expectations and seemed to simply sink without leaving much of a trace. By then, the console market had simply exploded into new life here in the UK, with the Sega Master System doing great, the NES not so much, too little too late. But the Mega Drive was the console to own, so I jumped in and never looked back. I watched from afar as the Falcon was announced and went head-to-head with the CBM 81200, and like the STE, simply sank without a trace. At this point for me, Atari were over. I went for the Sega Game Gear over the Nintendo Game Boy, and initially ignored the Lynx, as yet again it seemed like Atari had the hardware and were making huge promises, but just where were the games? They simply didn't have anything like the software support they needed. I luckily did invest heavily into the Lynx in later years, owning both a Mark I and Mark II console and a decent range of games. But I was still very much a Sega man. Until Sega screwed the pooch with the Mega CD, something I'd bought on day one for £270 based on Sega's promises, and was disappointed by lack of killer games. During the Mega Drive Mega CD era, there were rumors / press reports of Atari coming back to the home console market with a 32-bit console, the Panther. The specs on paper sounded amazing, and gasp, Jeff Minter was on board, key selling point to myself. Atari then amazed everyone by announcing the Panther was dead. 32-bit technology was old hat already. They had a 64-bit monster in the works in the likes of Game Master Magazine and C+VG. Computers and video games, I'm guessing. The two key UK magazines I was reading at the time went ape for it. Even the Commodore press were shouting the praises of the hardware. CU Amiga lapping it up. Jaguar could seemingly do no wrong. Press were raving about how its specs dwarfed the 3DOs, its low price, the planned CD drive, and of course the games. Preview shots and comments of Rebellion's Checkered Flag 2 promised a virtual racing beater. Talk of the game running so fast on the hardware Rebellion had to slow it down. Games Master Magazine previews of Tempest 2000 in later review. Freelancer 2120 CD and Games Master TV showing AVP running on video. OMG, the killer app. To myself, a massive Aliens fan, this was years ahead of the 2D Mega Drive and SNES Alien 3 games I'd loved. I simply had to have this hardware, and it seemed this time Atari was putting everything behind making the console a success, and had the much-needed software support on board. UK/European developers seemed to love the machine, as did the US developer community, or so we were told. The list of planned announced games was mightily impressive. For every big PC/CD game, Atari seemed to be assuring us there'd be a Jaguar version coming to sit alongside their own exclusives. I suppose looking back in hindsight, I should have waited to see if Atari really could deliver what it had promised and learned from the Lynx era, if nothing else, that announced games didn't mean actual games. To be a UK Jaguar owner seemed to be one where you'd sit at the gaming table expecting a feast of software, and whilst you were thrown the occasional platter of goodness, AVP, Tempest 2000, best cartridge version of Doom, best cartridge version of Syndicate, Iron Soldier, Rayman, etc. I even loved Hover Strike despite all its flaws. I simply hadn't bought a Jaguar to pay for 256-color Mega Drive ports, which so many games seemed to be. The UK press soon got wind of this, and the 64-bit dream oh so soon turned sour, especially when the PS1 Saturn hit. The Jaguar was struggling to deliver games on cartridge, and was the much vaunted CD drive, which rolled out for various trade shows, never seemed to have any real software running on it. Things like Freelancer 2120 never seemed any closer to completion, and once Saturn/PS1 hit, UK press turned on both Jaguar and 3DO as yesterday's news, openly mocked the games. This was a very sour time, as these magazines had built the hype up, both to get folks like myself to invest in them, and now it seems we were bloody fools for buying them. PlayStation, Saturn, etc. were where it's at. Where did Atari go wrong with Jaguar? Basically, they had a mountain to climb here in the UK alone, as they were something of a laughingstock by the time the Jaguar hit. Failures of the A8 range, Atari 400, 800, XL, XE, XEGS console, STE, Falcon, and failing to deliver on key games promised for the Lynx. So whilst they knew they needed UK press on board, they were all too aware of the risks, that knives were set, waiting for Atari to stumble and trip, and when they did, the press leapt. Simply being the cheapest wasn't going to convince anyone, punter nor press. Atari needed far more games of quality of Wolfenstein 3D, AVP, Iron Soldier, Syndicate, Tempest 2000, and in large quantities. Jaguar in effect offered similar performance to a 486 MHz DX PC for a fraction of the price, and Atari should have invested in games that utilized that power, not signing up Super Nintendo Mega Drive ports just to get the software out there. They should have learned from previous failings. Don't promise what you cannot deliver. If a game's merely being discussed or signed, but not yet started, say so. If screens used to promote are concept shots or fakes, say so. Don't try to compete with more powerful newer systems, it's a fight you can never win. But above all, ensure that the games that support your hardware. I was never convinced by the CD add-on, let alone the planned VR headset. Why on earth would I invest more money in Jaguar when base unit had failed to supply the steady stream of killer software I expected? As you might be aware, I do a lot of research into lost Jaguar games like Freelancer, Creature Shock, Waterworld, Magic Carpet, Conan, etc., etc. Spoken to publishers, PR, coders, you name it. It's very clear no one really believed Atari had the resources to make a go of the Jaguar. I'm really glad you sent that in. I love hearing the UK perspective. I was under the impression that Atari had a better name in the UK than it did in the US at the time of the Jaguar's launch, due to the success of the ST computers, but it sounds like that might not have been the case. I don't know, Atari really wasn't a well-respected brand in the US at that time either, so maybe the UK was less worse. Either way, definitely a major uphill battle for Atari. Thank you also for the supplemental material you sent in. Some of that research that you've done will come in handy as we progress. Next email is from Blake. Blake says, Yo Shinto, I heard about your new project while listening to Ferg's 2600 podcast. While I listen to his Atari 2600 memories mainly as an academic way to catch up on retro gaming that was slightly before my time, the Atari Jaguar, on the other hand, is definitely a system for which I have strong memories. I don't know if my brothers and I were simply taken in by the pre-launch Bit Wars rhetoric, or the magazine screenshots of games like Trevor McFur and the Crescent Galaxy were what swayed us, but we were there day one to grab our 64-bit beauty. You've heard the saying, saving our nickels and dimes, right? Well, we did precisely that. For months, we collected every spare dollar and cent we could, including quite a bit of spare change. We eventually strolled into our local electronics boutique with a sizable grocery bag filled with cash. We weren't even courteous enough to put the coins in the paper rolls. Instead, we used plastic Ziploc bags marked as $1 for pennies, $10 for quarters. You get the idea. That poor guy behind the counter, I don't know if we just looked like trustworthy kids or the fact that our mom was standing right back there with us boosted his comfort level with us, but he didn't even bother counting all $250 of our bag coinage. He just told us that he believed it was all there, and we were on our way home with the Jag, Cybermorph, and Raiden as well. I don't actually recall if my brothers and I saved enough for Raiden on our own, or if my mom just bought that for us outright, though. Memories fade with age. Extreme, depressing age. Yeah, I'm with you there. Despite having a short lifespan and being generally mocked today as a failure, we never regretted picking up our Jaguar. There were plenty of great exclusive games, though just as many disappointments too, and to this day, the Jaguar version of Tempest 2000 is my desert island game and second only to Super Metroid on my personal list of favorite games of all time. My older brother still has our original Jaguar hooked up at his house, which means that anytime I need my Tempest 2000 fix, I have to break out my slightly inferior Sega Saturn version. First world problems, yes? Good luck with your new endeavor. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all the highs and lows of Atari Jaguar history, and I will try to send in my own thoughts when you cover games for which I have strong memories. Yeah, I don't regret the money we spent on Jaguar. We had fun with it, some games more than others. Now, the Action Max, I do regret buying that back in 87 or 88. That money would have been better spent on a few 2600 or 7800 games. But that's a story for another podcast, which I'm not starting. Next message is from Mike, Trough on Atari Age. He says, Shinto, I'm so excited that you're doing this podcast. I first heard about it on Ferg's 2600 Game by Game podcast. I immediately paused Ferg's voice and went out and downloaded your intro episode. This is unprecedented. There may or may not have been jumping up and down. The Atari 2600 was a huge part of my childhood. It spawned a love of all things Atari that always stayed with me. I sort of missed out on the 5200 and moved into PC gaming in the mid-80s. My best friend had an Atari 7800, however, and I absolutely loved playing it at his house. I wanted my own, but I spent my birthday and Christmas present request budget in other ways. By the time the Atari Jaguar came out, however, I was working and I had something vaguely resembling quote-unquote disposable income. There wasn't any debate, I was buying a Jaguar. About that time, I was burning out on PC gaming, which was quickly deteriorating into first-person shooter of the month, and I was interested to see what sort of games you could get on a modern Atari console. I wasn't disappointed. When the Jag CD came out, I got that too, of course. I've bought a lot of game consoles since then, and I've enjoyed them all in turn. Eventually they all phased out of my life, but the Ataris have had lasting power. I still have my original 2600 and Jaguar consoles. Lately, I've been into the 2600 at the exclusion of all else. We can probably blame Ferg for that. But now I look forward to pulling out the Jaguar and re-experiencing the games as you make your way through them. The Jaguar had sort of a mixed library, but there were a lot of games that I loved. I'm excited to share my feedback and hear other people's as you make your way through the library. One final thing I want to share. Like you, I am now a father and husband, and that trumps all else, even Atari. I absolutely loved the moment in the intro where you recorded your daughter asking, "Where did you learn to podcast?" and your little exchange afterwards. It was neat that you called it out at the end of the episode and gave the background story, and the G.I. Joe reference. Thanks again for doing the podcast. Can't wait for the first full episode. Thank you, Mike. That's awesome. Yeah, Atari definitely had a big lasting impact on a lot of people, us included. If I were a couple years younger, would I feel the same way about Nintendo or Sega? I don't know. I do know that I have powerful memories of Atari. It was a constant presence in my childhood. I was always playing some Atari system or another from 1982 until probably 2002 when my wife suggested we get an Xbox. Yeah, I went from Jaguar to Xbox. And though I haven't played Atari today, I still get sentimental when I see that logo. I love that it's something I can share with my kids, and they seem to love Atari games too. Playing Atari games with my kids, definitely not time wasted. The Jaguar definitely has a mixed library, highs and lows, and I'm looking forward to talking about all of them. Some I haven't really played, and some I have long histories. It'll be a fun journey, I think. So thank you very, very much, Trough, for the compliments. I hope you enjoy the show. Next, I have an audio submission from Greg Polander, known as Soulblazer on Atari Age and elsewhere. So take it away, Soulblazer.
Hello, Shinto. This is Greg, aka Soulblazer, founder and co-host of the Super NES podcast. I wanted to send you an audio submission to help you get your podcast just off the ground and to share a few thoughts about the Jaguar and just podcasting in general on retro systems. Namely, I'm thrilled you're doing this. I don't have any personal history with the Jaguar. I never had one. I've only played one briefly, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But as somebody who majored in history and also somebody who really enjoys retro gaming as much as modern gaming, I'm really thrilled with whenever a new retro game podcast starts up. So I just really want to send you this submission as a sign of support, and just to let you know that I'm definitely going to be listening to the podcast. I don't really care what the podcast is about. If it covers a classic or a gaming system, I will be more than happy to listen to it, because I just love hearing more about the system and people, memories who had one of those back then, and the games on the system and that kind of stuff. It's just really all fascinating to me. If there was a podcast out there on the Studio, the Studio 2, or the Game Boy. I wish somebody would do a Game Boy podcast, or the PlayStation, or anything else out there. I'd be more than glad to listen to it, just because the fact that I just love hearing this stuff, and you're undertaking a major project here, like the Jaguar. I think I'm sure you know about how legendary the Flame Wars are, on this console, on the Atari Age forums. It's really fascinating just how the system can generate that much let's say passionate debate and love for it as the Jaguar does. I'm not sure I understand all the reasons behind that, but it's interesting nonetheless. Anyway, I'm really glad you're doing a podcast. I definitely agree with Ferg and Phil that you have a great voice for this kind of thing, and I really think your podcast is going to be excellent. I know how hard it is to get a podcast off the ground. I started the Super NES podcast a little over 6 months ago now, and there's been a few bumps, but things are going pretty well at this point, but again, as one fellow podcaster to another, I just really want to offer my support and my congratulations. And if there's anything I can do to help you out, please let me know. I'd be more than glad to share any limited experience or the advice I picked up in doing this along the way. So, the Jaguar, like I said, I've only ever played one once. It was sometime in, I want to say late 94, early 95. The exact time escapes me. I know I was a freshman in college at the time. A friend of my roommate at the time had a Jaguar, and I went over to his apartment once. We were over there for something else, to go out to Fun Spot or something, because I went to college at Plymouth State in Plymouth, New Hampshire, which is about a half an hour drive from Fun Spot. So I think it's the reason that we headed over there, just to kind of meet up before we headed over there, and I saw you at a Jaguar. He only had 3 games for the system, but I think they were some of the best games made for the system. And I got to play a little bit of each one, while we were killing time. Those 3 games were Alien vs. Predator, Tempest 2000, and Defender 2000. Tempest is an amazing game. I really don't know what else to say about it except to simply add my support for the game, for how great it is. It's a truly awesome game. It's Tempest times 10, basically. I've always liked Tempest. I've never really been very good at the game, mostly because of how insanely difficult that it is. But this is the first time I had played any of the versions like these games, and I really loved Tempest 2000 and just how stepped up that it was. The music, the gameplay, the action, everything about it was great. This is definitely a game worthwhile keeping a Jaguar around. I had a homemade version of this game on the computer for several years. Somebody had ported the game over to the PC and distributed it free of charge. Nowadays, I either play that version or Tempest 3000, which I think even improved upon even further. But really, what an amazing game Tempest 2000 is. Alien vs. Predator, I enjoyed the time playing it. It definitely is a groundbreaking game, and I can definitely see how a lot of how that game definitely set the ground for a lot of other games like it to come along in years down the road. Since then, I've looked at a Let's Play, played on all 3 sides on YouTube recently. I was the Marine for the short time I played that guy's house. But I think the game's a little bit slow, a little bit plodding today. It's one of those things that I think is still pretty fun like fun to play, but it's not quite as groundbreaking or great as it was back then. But then you could say that too, like about a lot of other games. I'm not sure that I would play this again. I don't really have any desire to do so, but I really can appreciate the game, like how great that it was, like when it came out, and just really how it was one of the best games like available like with the console. Defender 2000, I understand, is a pretty controversial game. I really liked it, like the little that I was able to play of it, like about half an hour or so. I think they did a great job of kind of stepping up Defender like into like a more modern day and a modern console. Pretty fun game all around. Definitely challenging, as if the original Defender wasn't difficult enough as it was. But definitely a nice game. I think I was lucky. I think I was able to play 3 of the best games that came out like with the system. Other things I remember thinking about this at the time. I'm not a fan of the controller. I have small hands, so that big controller was not it was a pretty awkward fit, like in my hands. Really reminded me a lot like about the original Xbox controller, like how large and clunky that was, and how that was difficult to fit in my hands also before it came out, like the improved S model of that. And the keypad right in the center kind of seemed like an interesting design. Kind of a throwback to the old days. I'm not really sure why Atari threw it in there. And not enough buttons on the regular controller. The whole controller, I wouldn't say it's the worst controller made, but it certainly didn't make a very good impression on me. The overall console itself seemed pretty impressive as far as what it could do. If it had come out a little bit earlier, and if Atari had tried to stick on more evolutionary, advanced 2D titles to kind of be a superior Super NES / Genesis, I think the system could have done better. But in hindsight, I've always said and I've always wondered. I'm not sure Atari should have released Jaguar in the first place. Atari just didn't have the financial means or the support or like the backing of third-party companies by that time to really have the system succeed. Consoles were not as difficult to get launched then as it is now. I'm sure you know about how much Microsoft lost just to get the Xbox going in the first place. But by this time period, the early 90s, Atari had taken such a beating. I think they already had closed their PC division, like in '93. So the company just didn't have the financial support. I think Atari would have gone a lot better if they had simply become a publisher, much like Sega is these days. They got out of the hardware business and abandoned ideas to publish the Jaguar and stop doing the links and just simply become a publisher. I think that would have resulted in the company still being around today, instead of being sold and merged as what happened a couple years later. So it's not a bad system like when I remember seeing it. Like I've heard about it and watched over the years, but not a system I really had that much interest in. Not a system I would have definitely bought at the time, because I was certainly happy playing my Super NES, like in my and playing my computer games. But still, having said all that, I certainly appreciate the system that like what I try to do, and I'm definitely going to be listening to the episode of the podcast, hearing more about the stories of people who had the system back then, and the games and the games and whatnot. I have a job where I do computer processing most of the day. It's pretty tedious, so I depend upon a steady diet of podcasts to keep me interested and going throughout my 8-hour shift. So the more podcasts out there, the better. So thank you again for doing this podcast, Shinto. I hope it really goes well for you. Even though you never contributed anything like to my podcast, I will try to offer any support advice for yours that I can. Just kidding, by the way. I'm not even really sure if you had a Super NES back then, or whatnot. But anyway, I don't know if I'm going to be doing any more submissions, because, like I said, my knowledge of the game library is so limited. But I just really want to submit something to you to start your podcast to help to show my support, and to thank you again for doing it. So hope you have fun doing the podcast, and take care.
Okay, I do actually have a Super Nintendo. I bought a core system. It was just the console and controller, I think for $99. It was a couple years into the console's lifespan, at least. I don't have the same console I originally had back then. The case had turned yellow, nasty yellow, which didn't go well with the purple accents. So what I did was I traded it in for a different console at my local used video game store. A fair trade, the yellow console plus a few games I didn't play anymore, for a clean console with the proper colors which I didn't feel ashamed to have on display. If only I could do the same thing for my Atari XEGS. Return it to its pastel glory. When you were looking for a co-host for the SNES podcast, I almost put my hat into the ring, but I was thinking heavily about the Jaguar podcast, and that would have delayed or prevented my making this podcast, so I didn't. But maybe we could work out a guest spot someday. I could talk about Clay Fighter, or Alien 3, or Super R-Type, or Spider-Man, X-Men Arcade's Revenge. Any of those games that I had back then, which I remember fondly. Well, Spider-Man, X-Men, not so fondly. But yeah, I'm a big Atari fan, but I do own and enjoy several other systems, including the Super Nintendo. You mentioned the flame wars surrounding the Jaguar, and yeah, that was a concern for me. It would have been a lot safer to go with the Atari Lynx instead, and I almost did for that very reason. There's lots of, shall we say, vibrant discussion, resulting in a large number of locked threads on the Atari Jaguar forums. It's been about 20 years since the Jaguar's demise, and I hope, naively as it might be, that we can move past the bickering and discuss it rationally. A lot of the arguments I've seen revolve around what the Jaguar could have done, were its potential unlocked, and for the purposes of this podcast, though, I'm not that interested in hypothetical situations. I want to talk about what the Jaguar did do, the games that did come out. We can talk about unreleased hardware and software in due time, but do I have Quake for the Jaguar? No, so let's not get into whether or not the Jaguar could have handled Quake, because it didn't. Comparisons between the Jaguar and other consoles, similarly, I'll keep those to a minimum as well, except for concrete qualities like the price tag or number of buttons on a controller. I'll probably compare games, cross-platform games between the Jaguar and other consoles, but to discuss whether or not the Jaguar was better than the 3DO or 32X or ColecoVision or RDI Halcyon, that's entirely subjective, so we'll just leave it at that. You were talking about Atari not having the resources that Jaguar really needed. That reminds me of an interview with Martin Brennan, from Flare 2, where he said that Sony announced that they were spending $200 million acquiring software for the PlayStation. $200 million. That's just for getting developers on board. That doesn't include the marketing budget or anything, so Atari's resources were way behind what Sony could muster. The Trammell family had sold some land in Taiwan and made somewhere in the order of $60 million, which is a whole boatload of money, but even if they sank every penny of that into the Jaguar development, Sony still would have squashed them. It's not easy or cheap to launch a new video game console, and history shows that it really didn't work out for Atari and the Jaguar. Thank you very much for your submission, Soul Blazer. Even though you say you won't be a regular contributor, I'm grateful for your send-off. The thing that has really struck me about the retro gaming podcasting community is how welcoming and generous everyone is. Sure, we may have argued red-faced about which system was better when we were kids, but retro gaming is a shared hobby that we can all get around, and that's awesome. You can hear more from Soul Blazer on the SNES podcast. That's snes.gamebygamepodcast.com, if I can plug my own information hub for no real reason other than the fact that I can recite the URL off the top of my head. Next audio submission is from Nick, known as Sloth Machine on Atari Age, so here we go.
Hi Shinto. I was searching to see if the Retroist had any new episodes, and after typing in his name into the search on my phone, I see a new podcast among the results, the Atari Jaguar Game by Game podcast. I was quite surprised. I haven't been keeping up on my podcast news, so I was even more shocked when I saw that it was hosted by Shinto. I said to myself, awesome. So I set the Retroist aside, and I quickly gave the first episode a listen, and it was great. I'm really looking forward to this series. I submitted a few audio entries to Ferg, so I thought I would give you my Atari Jaguar story about the console itself. Back in what I think may have been 1996, I was living at home, a typical teenager, mooching off my parents. I didn't have a job at the time. We would get Servant merchandise catalogs in the mail. We were on their mailing list. And I remember always just going straight to the video game selection of the catalog. In fact, I would do that with pretty much any department store catalog, just go right to the video games. However, this particular time, Service Merchandise was selling the Atari Jaguar console on closeout for only $50, and it came with a bundle of games too. there was a bunch of different bundles. I don't remember all of them, but I remember the one I got, obviously. It came with Cybermorph, the pack-in game, Raiden, and Alien vs. Predator. And I was just really excited to get the console in the mail. I remember opening it up and just looking at that cool black box with the yellow eyes. It was just really cool looking. And even opening the console up and looking at it itself, it just looked really futuristic, and that matte black and that really interesting controller, which was pretty comfortable in my opinion, despite the reputation it has. And I spent a lot of time, many hours, playing that console. And I'll go into more detail of the games that I had when the time is right. And I never owned an Atari computer, 5200, 7800, or even a Lynx. From the 2600, I migrated to the NES, then the Genesis, with some Game Boy on the side. So getting the Jag, can I call it the Jag, or is that too lame? I don't know. Either way, getting that console was my rekindled connection with Atari. And for a brief moment, it made me really nostalgic for Atari, since the 2600 was my first console. I was reminded at how awesome and fun Atari was, and that's a feeling that I lost since I abandoned it for other consoles until I got the Jag again. Now, my Jaguar ownership was a bit brief. The problem was software. Not the software quality, just the fact that I couldn't get my hands on any software. The console was on its way out in 1996, and the stores were swept clean. I don't ever remember finding any Jaguar games in sight. I remember going to the Atari website. Now remember, this is around 96, so it was pretty primitive then. But you could buy games online. But they were still full retail price, I think even maybe a little bit above. And convincing my parents to buy some more games with my birthday and Christmas way out of sight, that was a no-go. And none of my friends owned a Jaguar either. So, as a kid, half your game experiences were by swapping cartridges with your friends. And I only had those 3 games. So after a while, the console sadly got set aside. I'd probably go back to my Genesis. And I remember the Sega Saturn starting to get some steam, and that started to get my attention as well. Eventually, I sold my Jaguar. And today I look back and think, what the hell, man? But this is where your podcast comes in. It gives me a chance to go back into that world. Maybe I'll pick up a Jaguar on eBay and play along with the podcast. Hopefully the Shinto effect won't cause prices to spike. So here's to the future, or past. One of those. Bye.
The Shinto effect. I don't know. Jaguar games are already pretty expensive on eBay. I'd hate to be responsible for inflating those prices if I had that sort of power, which I don't. At least not yet. Service merchandise. Not a catchy name for a store, but I like that place. Both nearby malls had one. And I would walk around the electronics and video game sections whenever I was there. The first time I saw a Sega Genesis was at a service merchandise store. Were they mail order only when you got the Jaguar? I seem to remember the brick and mortars closing down very early in the 90s. That's cool that you're able to get it on the cheap in a bundle. I don't think I really took advantage of any of the Jaguar liquidation that was going on at the time. I had already paid full retail for everything. I'm glad I'm not the only one who likes the Jaguar controller. I'm not quite sure why it gets all the hate. I actually wrote a letter to Electronic Gaming Monthly defending the Jaguar's controller. They never published it. It's fine if you call it the Jag, I don't mind that. What I do mind are lame cat puns. Not a fan of lame cat puns, and there are certainly a lot of those swirling around the Jaguar.
Oh Shinto, now you're really asking for it.
Thanks for the audio submission, Nick. Good stuff. Next up is Phil from the Atari 7800 Game by Game podcast and No Swear Gamer on YouTube. So, Phil, let her rip.
I don't know how I heard that Atari was coming out with a Jaguar, but I was instantly interested, of course being an Atari 7800 owner who had no other option but to go another system when the next generation came out. And for me, that was a Sega Genesis. But when the Atari Jaguar did come out, I didn't really have the money to buy one. Not only that, I really didn't see them around nearly as much as I saw the Atari 7800. I recall seeing them at my local Babbage's at the mall. They actually had them in the window display along with a few of the launch titles. I can't remember them all, but I know Trevor McFur and the Crescent Galaxy was one of them, but there just wasn't a lot of titles. So I kind of waited my time. I'd never been one to really afford systems right when they came out. Usually I had to wait for the price to drop, but sadly something happened. The Jaguar just wasn't getting support, and it quickly left Babbage's and other stores as well. And if you ever did find one, there was only a few games here and there. I still vividly remember going through a mall and seeing a copy of Atari carts at an electronics boutique and thinking, wow, that's really interesting. I wish I could pick it up, but I didn't even have a Jaguar at the time, and little did I know it probably would have been an okay investment, knowing how much they go for today. But, nonetheless, I missed it during its initial launch. Actually, I remember Hugh. I listened to the Retro League podcast. I remember Hugh saying that he worked at an electronic boutique at the time that launched, and they were given no notice. All they got was a box with a couple systems in it and like a, oh, what is this? Kind of a quizzical look on their faces when they came out, and said that a lot of people when they were in the store had a similar look on their face, like, wow, Atari's still around? I also recall someone in the UK, I forget what podcast it was on, maybe the Intellivisionaries, but they were talking about how when it came out, it was just the hottest thing over there, but Atari was doing a really poor job of stocking them, and they just didn't have enough to meet the demand. When a store would have orders for like 10 or 20, they'd only get 2 in. So sadly, I think Atari botched it overseas as well. Really is kind of crushing to me, because I was a big Atari fan and I really wanted the Jaguar to succeed. So when did I get a Jaguar? Well, hold your horses. Let's not get there yet. So I remember seeing them in KB Toys next. And this was after they kind of run their course. KB must have bought them on liquidation, because they had them for sale. I want to say they were $50 a console. And the games were about $10 a piece. They were very cheap. And they even had a kiosk. This was the first time I ever played an Atari Jaguar. Cybermorph was, of course, the game that they had on the kiosk. And I actually enjoyed it, despite what I read in some reviews about it being not a very good Star Fox clone. I actually thought it was a pretty good game. I actually had fun with it, and I wanted a Jaguar, but I don't even think I had $50 at the time. I guess that was being a poor college student. Well, a few years later, something interesting happened. You see, during this time, this wonderful thing called the internet started popping up, and it opened up new avenues. And as I got some part-time jobs, eventually I had a little bit of spending cash. And late in my college career, around the year 2000, there's this new site called eBay. And I started dabbling in it. And what I would do is I would sell a system and buy a new one with a bunch of games. And then after a while, I would sell that system with the games and buy a different one. It was almost like a retro gaming library for me. I had a Nintendo at the time that I purchased from Buncoland. It was my first Nintendo, but I bought it late in the 90s. And for under $100, I got all the classics, a really good deal, and I put that up for first, and then I sold it, and I started getting some other things. I think the next thing I bought was another Atari 7800 with a bunch of 2600 and 7800 games, including some from O'Shea's. And yes, sad to admit, I sold that one too, but it may have been the next thing I bought. I bought an Atari Jaguar with a bunch of games. I can't remember everything that came with it, but I'm pretty sure Cybermorph was one of the games. I remember getting it back home and getting that box in the mail and just being excited. And I actually think it came with the original Jaguar box as well, and all the inserts that came with it. Popping it in, it was just, it's hard to explain, but I was like a kid again. Really enjoyed it. I even remember being fascinated by this thing called an overlay, something I had not seen since the Intellivision days. I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. I'm not one of those guys who actually hates the Atari Jaguar controller. I actually think it's pretty comfortable. I do wish that they would have came out with the Pro version first with using the 6 buttons on the top, but the little keypad feature that looks like an ATM kind of thing, it can be very useful at times. And I'm one of those guys who will actually defend the Jaguar. I actually did a little mini Retro Junkies episode on why the Atari Jaguar was better than the 32X with my friend Aaron from the Retro Obscure podcast. And it's not everybody agrees, but I think that the Jaguar is better than the 32X. I think it has a more diverse library. I have some other memories of it as well, but You know, I'm going to save the memories of the games and some other things. I will share this one memory. The Jaguar I have now, how I got it, I actually stumbled upon it at Craigslist in my area, which is very bizarre because you don't really see a lot of retro games in my area. Guy was selling it with a jungle green Nintendo 64 and some other things. Wanted $90 for everything, and I gladly paid that, knowing how much Jaguars were going for. That was about the price of a Jaguar, if not more. So I gladly paid that, brought it home, and was very dismayed. I popped in a game, turned it on, nothing. Swapped it out for another game, turned it on, nothing. No power light, nothing. I even tried turning it on without any game in it. No power light was on. I was very discouraged, thinking that I bought a broken Jaguar. Then I read somewhere that if a Jaguar doesn't detect a game, it won't turn on. So I cleaned the games really good. I had to give them a really good cleaning. And finally, that red light started to glow. I heard that have you played Atari Today jingle going on, the little cube on the screen, and I was back and Jaguar Nirvana. It was a great feeling to finally play a Jaguar again. Oh, Shinto, I'm so glad you're doing this podcast. I know you're going to do a good job. You got me thinking about windshield wipers now, out of all things. And I really enjoyed your theme song at the beginning of episode 0. I'm glad you answered that. Yeah, you actually did that. I think you're going to do a great job. Correction, I know you're going to do a great job. Sometimes I wish I could hop back in my time machine, go back to that KB toy store and stock up on Atari Jaguar stuff. Get some games for $10, some extra cords for a couple bucks, maybe even a Pro Pad. But what would the consequences be if I went back in time? I might disrupt the space-time continuum, and who knows, maybe something could happen to your show or my show, or maybe something could happen to me. But, you know, we know that's not possible, because if it was, I wouldn't be able to do this audio.
Did you just feel something? That was weird. Bishop, did something weird just happen? Like, I don't know, some sort of temporal disturbance?
No, everything is perfectly normal.
Oh, okay. What was I doing?
You were responding to listener feedback on the Sega 32X Game by Game podcast.
Okay, yeah, that sounds right. Thank you very much, Phil, for the audio submission. It was supposed to cut out like that. Yeah, it's definitely hard to track down Jaguars in stores. I must have lucked out that I had a store nearby that was reasonably well stocked with Jaguar stuff. Maybe they stocked it just for me. I'm kind of surprised how rare Atari Carts is, because I bought it off the shelves at my local Walden Software, just like many of my other Jaguar games. The story Hughes wrote about the Jaguar launch was definitely interesting from the perspective of an employee at one of the major software chains of the day. I read his account. It was on his website, and I think he put it into an ebook called My Loser Phase. Also, of course, he talked about it on the Retro League podcast in the Jaguar launch episode. I'll see if I can track down a link for the Loser Phase story and include it in the show notes. Atari did really seem to botch the release, both here and abroad, and I heard similar stories from the UK, but not from Lost Dragon earlier. I knew of Jaguar's release because I followed Atari in the video game press very closely, but most people did not. It was barely on TV, if at all, so I could see why the Jaguar's release would have been a complete surprise to most people. Thank you so much, Phil, for your submission and your support over the last few months. I kind of wish we lived in the same part of the country, which we don't, so that we could play some of those co-op Atari 7800 games that you end up having to go solo. Well, geography, what can you do? Unless Atari joystick signals over TCP/IP with a Raspberry Pi on either end and a camera feed. It'd be kind of laggy, so no ball blazer, but Dark Chambers would work well enough. I wonder if anybody has done something like that yet.
Shinto, are we still doing the alternate universe thing?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Let me set you back to normal. How's that?
Much better. That goatee was getting itchy.
Hey, the goatee's what sells it. And our final audio submission is from the man who started it all, Ferg, from the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast. So instead of him introducing me, I'm introducing him. Take it away, Ferg.
Hey Shinto, this is Ferg here, and I just want to congratulate you on starting the podcast on the Jaguar. I think you're the 7th Atari podcaster now. David's going to be joining you soon with the Atari XEGS, but I think people are calling it the Zegas now. Anyway, very glad that you're doing this. I'm a big fan of your audio submissions on my show and Phil's and RK and Willie's show. And you seem to know what you're doing in the recording department, so that's good. I'm glad about that. And, of course, in the coding department, you know what you're doing. I really like the game-by-game podcast page that you did. I would definitely recommend it for anybody who wants to do a podcast and doesn't know what to do a podcast about. Just pick something that's not on that list. I hope you enjoyed doing the podcast. I don't know how many games are off the top of my head for the Jaguar, but I don't think there's as many as there are for the 2600. I should have picked a smaller system. But anyway, I wish you the best of luck with it, and I hope it goes well for you. It can be frustrating sometimes, but it's very rewarding, I find. And just even one person giving feedback is such a great experience for me, and I know other people have said that too, but it's just a lot of fun to do it, and it's very gratifying. So on to my stupid Jaguar story. I think, if I remember correctly, the Jaguar came out in 94, I'm sure you've already said. At that point, I had just gotten a Super Nintendo for my wedding present from my wife. And the only thing I had really before that was the Sega Master System that she got for me on closeout at KB when we were both working there. So I wasn't really collecting much, and I didn't really know too much about Atari yet because I hadn't started collecting the 2600. And it just seemed kind of suspect that they were putting out a new system. Even with me, I didn't really know much about the history of the crash or anything like that. The name Atari just had left a bad taste in my mouth at that point. So I wasn't really enthusiastic about the new system because I had the Super Nintendo, so what do I need a Jaguar for? Eventually, I did pick one up. I don't remember what year it was. When I started collecting games, I started saving all my receipts because I would get a lot of stuff at Funkoland and stuff. I saved all my receipts from a 4-year period, so I would have had that receipt from the Jaguar. Unfortunately, I threw those all away, and I'm sorry I did that. But it was either 96 or 97 when I bought the Jaguar. I had heard from a friend that I think it was Nobody Beats the Wiz was closing them out at $20. I was living in New Jersey at the time. I drove all around New Jersey trying to find a Nobody Beats the Wiz that had a Jaguar for $20. I think I went to maybe 5 of them. It was an all-day affair, and I finally found one that was way down the shore. It was about 2 hours from where I lived, and it was the only one left. And I bought it, and I think I picked up a couple of games there too. They were already getting kind of scarce by that point. So I brought it home, and I think I had played Tempest before. I hadn't really played anything else. Had to have Tempest, one of my favorite arcade games when I was a kid, and that will be the only other audio submission that you get from me will be about Tempest, I think. I started collecting games where I could find them. I don't remember how much they were. Maybe like under $20 probably. I don't think I paid more than $20 for any games. I had a little bit of a collection. My brother-in-law Kurt got Alien vs. Predator for me. I bought the pinball games. Remember getting Pitfall, I think. Basically whatever was cheap I would buy. I did draw the line at White Men Can't Jump, although it did have the 4-player adapter. I think that was $25, so I didn't buy that one. But I played it a little bit. I had it hooked up for a little while, and then we moved, and I've said this before, everything kind of fell apart with game collecting, and there wasn't really much Jaguar left after 1998 around in the stores. I hadn't really started on eBay yet at that point, so it just kind of languished. And I can't remember how many years after that, but I decided, hey, let's bring out the Jaguar. So I brought it over to Kurt's house and all the games. I probably had like a IKEA shelf full of games for the Jaguar. That's about it. But I brought the Jaguar over to his house and we played it, and it was just very, very underwhelming playing the Jaguar. So I decided that Tempest wasn't enough for me to keep the Jaguar and the games around, so I sold it. Maybe 2006 or so. I don't regret selling the Jaguar at this point because I don't know if I would want to play along with the games as you cover them, really, because of that last experience that I had with it. But I definitely will chime in when we get to Tempest, when you get to Tempest, I'm saying we. So that's my Jaguar story. Again, best of luck to you. I'll be listening. Even though I don't have a Jaguar, I really enjoy listening to podcasts about video game history. So this is part of video game history. So I will look forward to listening. And again, best of luck. And I'll talk to you on the Tempest episode.
Thank you, Ferg. It's fine that you don't like the Jaguar. I don't mind that at all. In terms of what was available on other systems at the time, especially Saturn and PlayStation, yeah, the Jaguar may have been underwhelming. But I'm not making such comparisons. The Jaguar is what it is, and I'll be discussing its games on their own merits, or lack thereof, isolated perhaps. We'll see. I did say that I've been pleasantly surprised recently by a few Jaguar games that I never bought back then because I expected them to be terrible based on the thrashings they received both then and now. Dr. Clue might be happy to hear that, but yeah, I'm hoping that a no expectations, no regrets sort of approach will work well with this show. A lot of the games I haven't really played in several years, so it'll be kind of fresh eyes. I don't call it Zegas, it'll always be XEGS for me. More syllables, but doesn't sound as silly. I have some good stories about that console, so I'm looking forward to the podcast. Hopefully he'll take some audio submissions. Thanks again, Ferg. I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast were it not for you and the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast. I've gotten such great feedback so far. It's very encouraging, and I'm having fun putting the show together. It's a lot of work, a lot of time, but I don't think the time spent on creative endeavors is really wasted. Will Wheaton, the actor and author, used to say, "Get excited and make things." That's not his quote originally. He was echoing someone else. I don't know who, but it's a great slogan. Get excited and make things. So that's what I'm doing. Okay, I just looked it up. The saying may have originated as a parody to the Keep Calm and Carry On World War II era poster, and it seems to be attributed to Matt Jones. So now we know. And no, I'm not going to do the G.I. Joe thing in 2 consecutive episodes. It's been a long road so far, but in fact we're just getting started. Next episode we're talking about Cybermorph, the original pack-in, followed by Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy, Club Drive, and Raiden. If you have any memories you'd like to share about these upcoming games, or your Jaguar origin story, it's never too late, please send those in to jaguar@gamebygamepodcast.com. All show information can be found on the Game by Game Podcast Information Hub at jaguar.gamebygamepodcast.com. Coming up after the theme song, I have a new segment. It's related to the topics covered in this episode, but not directly related to the Jaguar. I'm done with my Jaguar coverage. So if you want to hit stop on your MP3 player, that's okay. I won't mind. I probably won't even notice. Until next time, remember that there is a lot of good to be found out there in this world of ours, even with widely ridiculed video game consoles. So do try to keep an open mind and a joyful heart. Thank you for listening. Sometimes when putting together an episode, I come across stories that are tangentially related to the things I discuss. Rather than interrupt the narrative to chase down these stories, I've gathered them together here in a segment I unimaginatively call Story Time with Shinto. At the very beginning of this episode, I made a slightly disparaging comment about Heathrow Airport in London. I should elaborate on that. So December 2010, I was flying to Amsterdam for work. I had work to do in London as well, but the site wasn't ready for me yet, so the plan was to hit Amsterdam first, then take care of London on the way back. I should probably mention at this point that I was a systems engineer overseeing data center deployments, not a jewel thief or international spy or anything more exciting and or illegal. So, naively thinking that I would be in climate-controlled environments all the way to Schiphol, the Amsterdam airport, I packed my cold weather gear and checked baggage. When we arrived at Heathrow for our connection, the plural here includes my business partner with whom I traveled all over the world doing this kind of work, there were some snowflakes falling outside. Not a lot of snow, mind you, so I was quite surprised to see a whiteboard listing flights canceled due to weather, and among them, our flight to Amsterdam. So we went to the ticket counter to rebook. Now, it's widely known that nobody can queue like the British, and the line to the ticket counter was massive, with the large number of canceled flights that morning, which is basically everything. But nobody complained. We all stood around and chatted. A group of musicians broke out their instruments and started playing. I love the British. I was able to call a nearby hotel while we waited and booked the last 2 rooms they had, since it would be at least 3 days before we could catch another flight. After we got through the line and rebooked, we went to baggage claim to try to get our luggage. Everything was grouped by destination city, and our bags were not to be found. We were told to try back later, so off we went to the hotel. This was my first time in London during the winter, and man was it cold. It wasn't the cold so much as the wind, and my coat was in some bag somewhere in the vicinity of Heathrow. Through the one layer I was wearing, the wind cut like long rows of scalpels. It was miserable. Also miserable was the food at the hotel. Well, that's a bit unfair. It was edible, but overpriced and inauthentic, so we tired of it quickly. There was one restaurant within walking distance, the Pheasant Inn, a cold half-mile away, but man was it worth it. Fish and chips and strongbow. Awesome. We checked back with the airport daily, looking for our bags, but no luck. We eventually gave up and hit a TK Maxx for some clean clothes. We're getting desperate by this point. They had to dust off their magstripe reader so that they could use our lame, chipless American credit cards, but at least we had something else to wear. I had a flight out the next night, and my business partner had to catch a flight the following morning, so I was on my own to Amsterdam. As I handed them my ticket to board at Heathrow, a little alert went off on their terminal. They held me nervously aside as the rest of the flight boarded, and then told me, much to my relief — I was worried that they thought I was a jewel thief or international spy or something interesting and illegal — that my luggage had been located and was in fact placed on this very plane. Sure enough, at the Schiphol baggage claim, I found my suitcase and promptly put on my coat and gloves. I stood outside for a long time to catch the shuttle to my hotel, close to an hour, but you know what? It was awesome. Unlike London, Amsterdam that night had no wind, just gently falling snow, which accumulated about 3 inches on the ground. As I stood there, chatting with a gentleman from Scotland, I was downright euphoric. Between the warmth of the coat and the beautiful Christmas decorations and the pleasant cold of the Amsterdam night air against my face, it was one of the best travel experiences I've had, standing there, waiting for my shuttle. Speaking of Sinclair research, in 1993 I went to a garage sale and found a Timex Sinclair 1000 computer, which is the American version of the Sinclair ZX81, complete with a 16K memory expansion. At the time, I was all about adding gratuitous electronics to my car. I had a cheap little portable black and white TV in there, a VCR, even a video camera that plugged into the VCR. There was a spot on top of the dash where I thought the Sinclair would fit nicely, but there was one problem, and that was the Sinclair had no power switch. I wanted to be able to switch it on and off. There was already a switch on the machine to select between 2 channels for the RF. I would only ever use one of the channels, so I decided to rewire the switch to function as a power switch. And in a way it worked perfectly because it stopped turning on as soon as you plugged it in. But in a more important way, it didn't work because my Timex Sinclair 1000 never booted up again. Speaking of proper British pronunciation, my grandmother, who passed away a little over a year ago, God rest her soul, was from England. In her final years, I would visit her regularly, usually with the kids. When she commented on how big my son was getting, which he was, his last surgery worked wonders, I told her about how his first pediatrician told us that we should add butter to everything he ate in order to get his weight up. She didn't understand. I said it again, and she still didn't understand what I was trying to say. Then it hit me. I needed to use the proper British pronunciation, butter, not the Americanized butter. She got it then, so occasionally I would have to translate American to British. Speaking of Horizon computers, I tried to convince my parents to help me buy an Atari ST computer because I was in high school and needed something more powerful than my dad's 8088. That computer of my dad's, we used that for everything. Writing games in BASIC, writing reports for school, playing Infocom text adventures, also some graphical games like Temple of Apshai and Artillery, primitive predecessor to Scorched Earth. We use that computer to create the template for our high score binder that I talk about a lot in other podcasts. Even drawing. Have you ever used a drawing program without a mouse? We didn't have a mouse. This machine ran DOS. There's also no color, just a 9-inch green screen. Seeing an Atari ST running the California Raisins demo on a 12-inch color monitor was mind-blowing. My mom asked if it was user-friendly, and I pointed out that it has a help key right there on the keyboard. My dad wasn't as convinced, though, because the cost of the spreadsheet software for the ST that was Lotus 123 compatible was prohibitively high. The man loves his spreadsheets, a character trait I certainly inherited. I don't remember what the software was called, but it was several $100s. I looked up reviews for Lotus 123 compatible software, LDW Power and VIP Professional, but they seemed to be priced lower than what my dad was quoted, so I don't know. I ended up buying a Packard Bell 386 a couple years later to help with my senior year high school work. I did get my Atari ST eventually, in 1995, buying it off of a guy on Usenet for $50. It's a 520 STM with monitor and floppy drive. The only really productive thing I did with it was used it as a dumb terminal from time to time. Might have played a couple games or demos. It needed more hardware to do anything that I would consider productive or useful. More memory certainly, and maybe a hard drive as well. So mostly, though, it just sat there and looked cool. I ended up selling it on Craigslist in 2008, for a profit though. I keep eyeing that missed FPGA computer by Lotharek, with the MIDI add-on board. But there's nothing like the look of an Atari computer. That Lotharek machine, if it had a 3D printed case in the style of Atari ST's industrial design, that would pretty much clinch it for me. So that's all the stories I had for this segment of Storytime with Shinto. I hope you enjoyed it, and probably be back next time.